Hello, this is Lisa Harrison, and today is Tuesday, the 31st of July 2012. And today I'm speaking with Andrew Basiago and Bernie Mendez. Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Lisa.
Hello, Lisa. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Now, Andrew, you're aware that I've spoken to Brett Stillings in the past, and we are going to be covering off some of the same material today, which is your involvement in a jump room program to Mars, what you believe to be Mars, back in 1980 during a training program that was conducted at and correct me if I don't get the pronunciation right, the College of the Siskiyous. Is that right?
Correct. We were trained in 1980, and then Brett and a number of the other teenage participants and I were jumping to a planetary domain that we believed was Mars during the 1981 to 83 period.
Now, one of the trainers that you claim to have been under at this point was Ed Dames, who's quite well known in the Black Ops community and those who follow Black Ops projects. But Ed is denying any involvement in this project whatsoever, isn't he? Still to this day?
Right. He's also denying the existence of a time travel technology that he directly worked with me when I was a child participant on Project Pegasus, which was under DARPA in the early 1970s. Project Pegasus was the U.S. time-space program at the time of the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense technical community. And Ed worked with me during one of the summers that I spent in New Mexico on a project basis, bringing me through a set of exercises in the Montauk Chair, which is a device that sends your mind forward in time, whereby you pre-experience an actual episode in your own future. And then when you're brought back to the present, you're debriefed so that you can articulate whoever is administering the Montauk Chair what you saw in your personal life. And sometimes that allows for a view into some of the events and conditions that exist in the future. Now, Ed worked with me directly in the Montauk Chair. He's denying the existence of the Montauk Chair as a time travel technology. Now, when Brett Stillings and I came forward on Coast to Coast AM on November 11th of 2010, November 10th of 2011, Ed actually called into the show to deny that he was our instructor. But now, in fact, we have three reliable witnesses. In addition to myself, we have today's other guest on your show, Bernard Mendez, who, as Bernie will describe, was an investigator who was enrolled in the jump room program as a participant observer to investigate several of the leading questions about what the project was doing and what we were finding. And also, from the time that William Brett Stillings contacted me, we've now located the email. It was on April 23rd of 2010. We've known that and agreed that our instructor at College of the Siskiyous was Major Dames. So at this point, it's three reliable witnesses against somebody denying involvement, and I would urge others to draw their own conclusions as to what that means.
Is he denying the existence of the chair, full stop, or the existence of the chair as a time-space device?
I'm searching out that citation. That's secondhand information. He certainly has never, during his 25, 30 years as a rather celebrated participant in the remote viewing program, ever acknowledged the fact that during the same years, the United States intelligence community and military were developing technical forms of remote viewing. I mean, he's the one who architected the phrase or introduced the phrase technical remote viewing. But technical remote viewing involved just that. It involved the derivation of time travel technologies like the Montauk Chair to view non-local events directly with technical assistance.
Mm-hmm.
He described technical remote viewing as basically a higher form of remote viewing. something not unlike the kind of guided imagination that goes on in Scientology. I believe that that's a dodge, and I believe it was constructed by Ed to conceal aspects of the U.S. time travel arsenal. And now we find that he's, in addition to having denied his background in direct time travel research and development, during the years when he's claimed he was just pioneering remote viewing, or helping to pioneer it, we now have him refuting 3 witness participants who are describing and actually lauding him for his phenomenal performance as our instructor in the jump room program of the early 80s. So my position vis-a-vis Ed is that there's really 2 ways to proceed here when you've been involved in this kind of work. You can either do the ethical thing and abide by the promises you made as an adult to maintain your project loyalty and secrecy, or you can do the right thing and serve a higher purpose by revealing what you did. So I respect his position not to come forward and reveal what he was part of. The problem is that, for example, among the jump room participants, in that room of about 20 people at College of the Siskiyous, beginning in mid-August of 1980, were only 3 veterans of Project Pegasus. They were myself, my late father, Raymond F. Basiago of the Ralph M. Parsons Company, and Major Ed Dames, who had worked with me in the Montauk chair back during the days when I was a child participant in Project Pegasus in the early 70s.
So let's just make some clarifications. In 1980, how old were you?
In 1980, I was 18, and I would turn 19 at the end of that summer on September 18th of 1980. So I was.
So in 1980, you're in college, specifically under this program for jump room travel to Mars, which
No, we were all actually at other colleges, meeting in a summer seminar under Ed Dames at just a campus that we were using as the setting for that educational function. We were all at different schools.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, in fact, I was making a transition from UC San Diego to UC Los Angeles, and I would enroll in UCLA in the fall. So this was a secret defense technical or intelligence community summer seminar. You know, really during the whole post-war era, agencies like the CIA, like DARPA, have used summer colloquia like this to train adults and young people for different secret functions. So this was basically a summer school or a summer seminar focused on what we should expect when we jump to Mars via jump room.
But previous to 1980, you said that you had been involved in, as a quite a young child, the Project Pegasus, which was the overall title given to the time-space technology and time-space research. So how, and you mentioned that your father was also involved. So this, I know that Brett's involvement in the jump room program did come via his father also. So what was your father's connection to all of this?
My father had been immersed in the U.S. time-space program from around 1966 when he first went to work for Parsons Jordan, which was a subsidiary of the Ralph M. Parsons Company, which I believe was being used as a cover for the emergence of the U.S. time-space program. Supposedly, Parsons Jordan had been formed to work on one project, which was a copper smelting project for Anaconda, the Chilean copper company. But I know from that time my dad was undertaking secret activities in the area of time travel. He had repeated some of Nikola Tesla's experiments when he was working at the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey from 1956 to 64. And worked for another company, and then he began working for Ralph M. Parsons in 1966. And I first teleported from a teleport at the Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Wood Ridge, New Jersey, sometime between September of 1967 and 68. And then I find myself being enrolled in Project Pegasus in fall of 1969 as a third grader. And my dad was serving on the project at the time that I entered it. I learned during my investigation, going back to the year 2000 and coming forward, that my dad was essentially the chief technical liaison between Parsons and the CIA on the theory and practice of teleportation. So he was frequently in New Mexico when I was jumping via teleportation back and forth. In fact, according to his calculation and that of Ralph Kubik, who was one of his colleagues at Parsons, my dad spent a total of 8 years in quantum displacement in New Mexico. So, for example, when he died in 1990, at age 66, chronologically speaking, biologically he was 74, because he had spent literally years teleporting to New Mexico, doing things there on a project basis, and then teleporting back to New Jersey, not just with a displacement of space, but teleporting back in time so as to arrive on the afternoon he left. So my dad was in the thick of it. I mean, he was essentially an expert on teleportation. He had done his course of studies at Lehigh in electrical engineering, physics, and mathematics. So he was educated for the role. He was a brilliant mathematician, and he had worked on classified aerospace projects going back to the ramjet project at Curtiss-Wright, which began in October of 1952, but only several months after the famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. by 9 extraterrestrial craft that were clocked at moving at 7,000 miles per hour. So he was really immersed in these urgent aerospace-related projects from the time that he graduated from Lehigh in 1951. I mean, a year later, he was already working on the ramjet, which we were designing, developing for the purpose of literally chasing extraterrestrial craft out of our atmosphere, away from the U.S. Capitol. And so,
was your involvement ever questioned? Did you ever object, or was this just, this is what you're doing, son, so get on with it?
They brought me in at such a young age. I mean, my age at the first time I teleported that I can remember, that I can actually connect to other events, for example, other events in New Mexico, took place when I was 6 years old. So I took my enrollment secretly in the cult of intelligence as just another dimension of being my father's son, just as you wouldn't question it if your father walked you your first day of school down at your local elementary school, or took your hand and walked you into church on Sunday morning. It was just something that he was doing. And
but
so for me,
when you're 6, though, I mean, when you're 6, you're inclined to think that whatever you're doing, everybody's doing. Was the secrecy around it, was that really impressed upon you, that this is not to be discussed with your friends, this is not this is not school talk? And when did you realize that, this wasn't what every other 6-year-old was doing, or 7-year-old?
Right. Well, so I was having different time travel experiences there through elementary school. I think the pressures of doing what I was asked to do, and the strangeness of these summers in quantum displacement in New Mexico with my father, which would be the summers of 71, the summer of 73 accessed from fall of 71, and then the summer of 72, and just the pressures of time traveling ultimately built up so that I had some heart-to-hearts, falling emotional outbursts with my dad by the 5th grade. But for the most part, I was just doing what I was asked, and I was sort of smoothly enrolled into his work. And then beginning in the fall of 69, we were placed in a learning lab for gifted and talented school children where we were alpha intelligence training. And by summer of 70, we were being educated in the different time travel devices. I kind of had the advantage of being kind of fast-tracked by my dad, by having been taken to some of the project locations and been and teleported with him to New Mexico and back by the 1st grade. So
was it just the fact that you were his son that got you in there, or was there something about you specifically that allowed you to be a prime candidate for this project?
That's a very complicated question, so I'll give you a complicated answer the only way I can, which is, clearly I was not just a gifted and talented youngster, I was a youngster with special abilities. Among the special abilities that I was evincing by age 3 or 4, So I went down to the basement, and I was listening to my father's thoughts. He was cogitating. He had just had some argument with my mother. And when you're married and in love with your spouse and you get angry, you start imagining slights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because my parents were very happily married and very much in love, as well as being married and very devoted to each other. But on this particular occasion, I was about 3 or 4 years old, and I went down. I was sitting on the steps down in the cellar, and I was looking over at my father when he was working at his table saw, and I heard him talking to himself, and I said, "Dad, that's not true. Mom doesn't just view you as a meal ticket. She really loves you." So he realized I was listening to what he was thinking, and I think he pointed up to the door, and said "Amscray," because I had kind of discombobulated him because he realized I was listening to what he was thinking. Another time, I'd been watching my older brothers build a 3 foot tall building on the floor of our rec room, and I was thinking, why on this planet, in this lifetime, do you have to stack something from the ground to make it stand in space? So I picked up their Tinker Toys and my alphabet blocks. So I couldn't have been that old, maybe 4 years old. And I just put them where I wanted them to be, hovering 3 feet off the floor, and began to just assemble this free-floating array of toys. Not really levitating them up to their positions, but just placing them where my mind wanted them to be with absolute intent. And they stayed there. In fact, some were actually rotating around each other like celestial orbs in a solar system, or around a central sun. So my father, with his BS in electrical engineering, came out of the cellar again after doing some of his weekend carpentry work down there, and was astonished to see his fifth child and his number 3 son, as he sometimes called me, levitating some small objects. So I'm sure that my special abilities were passed on to the U.S. Defense technical community, the intelligence community, because my father had been immersed in that realm, in that world, since his entry onto the Ramjet project almost 10 years before I was born, going back to October of 1952. Almost 9 years before I was born. So I'm pretty sure that my file, the U.S. military-industrial complex, was opened as a result of some of this childhood performance in the area of special abilities. Being a kind of a leading edge indigo.
Do you think your father
Um,
had any of these abilities too, or perhaps even your mother, that you inherited them from? And does anybody else in your family display them?
I think it was actually from my mother's side. My mother's mother was from an old Spanish-Italian line, and my Spanish-Italian grandmother once said to me when I was a very small child, she said, "Andrew, you're special. I'm special too. Just use your special abilities to help other people." So she was basically from sort of like a, Spanish alumbrados kind of bloodline.
Hmm.
She had what Italians call the strega. She was psychic and she was sensitive. So I think it was carried on the matrilineal DNA. My father was more a commoner kind of bloodline from southern Poland, from the horsemen of southern Poland that had been involved really in fighting Ottoman Turks a lot and sort of allowing the Enlightenment to happen actually by keeping Islam out of Europe. So I was from more of a kind of a rural horse riding Polish background on my father's side. On my mother's side, I found a lot of noble lineage. I mean, I've recovered 5 different crests and gone into some of the Spanish, Italian, Danish, and German noble blood on that line. But just practically speaking, in terms of psychic ability, I'm pretty sure it was from my mother's mother because she made reference to it. But it was really evident as a child. I mean, I was doing things like telling my parents news events that were going to be happening in several days. I mean, I would have dreams where I would see what was on the cover of the New York Times that would be arriving at our house in several days. So I think some of those special abilities must have gotten into a file that was opened on me during my early childhood because, look, this was the Cold War, and, under Project Talent, Admiral Rickover had instructed really the whole defense community to start looking for children who were evincing high leadership ability, intelligence, and psychic ability, because he wanted to exploit those, in our Cold War contest against the former Soviet Union, and he wanted to source talent that he could train to become adequate captains of nuclear submarines after admitting them to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. So I think the word was out, and they were looking for kids who could, remotely view the Kremlin and see, what illness Leonid Brezhnev had just developed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that in that context, I'm pretty sure my file was open. Now, other things that may have gone into my selection for Pegasus, by the latter experiences in my in the project and my term of service going up to the end of the summer of '72, I had encounters with team members in the future who knew who I was. And there's the whole question of how my book is going to be culturally received and what impact it will have on our reality, going forward. So there may have been a nonlinear explanation for why I was dropped in the program. I may have been dropped in the program because the future knew that I needed to be.
Understood. Yes.
So the word came back from the future. Well, here's somebody that we know you're going to be enrolling because we've met him. He's come here via Stargate to retrieve these microfilm summaries of future events that we're crafting for you. And he writes a book about the project and becomes a public figure. So I think there may have been a nonlinear explanation ultimately for my enrollment.
Interesting. It all becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really at some point becomes the past creating the preconditions. It becomes the future creating the preconditions in the past that the future knows as the past, but that the future may have caused. Retrocausation.
Do you, through your experiences, do you buy into the whole concept of different timelines?
Absolutely. I know to a personal certainty that we live in a quantum hologram of multiple, numerous, adjacent, similar, and dissimilar timelines, because when we were doing the chronovisor probes, we were literally cutting through to those timelines. When I did my first chronovisor probe at the General Manufacturing Company facility in Convent Station, New Jersey, in the fall of 1970, when the hologram was propagated and I was standing on the stage to the device, I immediately found myself walking towards what I thought was a soccer or rugby match, but when it came around the corner of the trees, the bend in the field, so to speak, I could see it was a U.S. Civil War battle. And actually, the battle overran my position. It was a battle situation in which the Confederate troops were prevailing and driving Union forces into retreat. And my position actually got overrun by Confederate soldiers. And when the hologram collapsed, and I asked one of the team leaders, one of the facilitators, these were sort of like women who were serving as docents who would attend to us if we became physically overwhelmed or emotionally overwhelmed. I asked the lady there from DARPA, how could you have sent me to a Civil War battle if there were never any, at least substantial Civil War battles besides minor, disagreements in New Jersey? And she said, well, we think that Civil War battle is now over New Jersey, but on another timeline. So my conception of the quantum hologram is that it's this dense compaction of multiple timelines occurring simultaneously, and we know them as the past, present, or future simply based on our position in the quantum hologram.
Okay, I think I understood that. Very good. Have you retained your memories all throughout this, or have you had to go through a process of trying to put these pieces back together?
Well, this really shows the efficacy of time of mind control, rather, as it evolved between, let's say, 1972 and 83, when I was out of the jump room program. I was subjected to a withering episode of brainwashing using the induction of pain when I left Project Pegasus, but never forgot what happened. I was actually resisting the brainwashing when it was happening. And so as I matured through junior high, high school, college, law school, graduate school, in the right moment, I would occasionally make reference to somebody who I believed would not ridicule me or think I was inebriated for stating that I had been in a federal time travel project as a child. But I so seldom got any kind of rational reception from anybody about making such a claim that I stopped talking about Project Pegasus and my experiences in it, but never forgot them. In fact, my first attempt to write my book was as a 10-year-old, or actually by then I was 11, as we were packing up our house in New Jersey in October, November of 1972, after Parsons moved from New York City to Los Angeles. We were packing up our belongings at our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, and I actually began writing on a small pad the different project locations, technologies, and experiences I had just had over the last 3 years, or intensively speaking, in Project Pegasus. And my dad found me writing in that pad and took it out of my hands, read it, and actually had me rip it up and flush it down the commode. So that was really my first attempt to write my book about what happened to me in Project Pegasus. I'm still writing that book. But I never forgot those experiences because they were so vivid, and essentially I overcame the brainwashing. Now, what happened in the Mars program 10 years later at an older age, when you think you would be more conversant in what's happened to you, actually was a case of successful brainwashing. Had Brett Stillings not called me written me that email on April 23rd of 2010, we would not be having this interview with Bernie Mendez today, because I was literally blocked about my jump room experiences that implicated Mars. Even at the time I published my landmark paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, in December of 2008. So there was a bit of a discontinuity in my life there, where I was lecturing about Project Pegasus and working on my book. And then I got interested in the Mars material in 2007 and 8 and wrote an important scholarly paper showing life forms on Mars. But even then, in 2008, that which had happened to me from 1980 to 83, when I was literally a college student, had very effectively been, what clearly wasn't memory wipe, because the memories have now come forward. Again, and I also resist the phrase mind control, because mind control bespeaks notions of entrainment. We weren't entrained. We were actually trained to be authentically acting in the field, to have natural responses to our experiences and the data that we were analyzing in the field. I think the proper phrase here, going all the way back to the Korean War, is actually brainwashing. The ability to have somebody remember what happened to them and even be able to trigger those memories if, for example, you interview them the right way, but to basically induce them not to really revisit the memories and to go forward in their life as if they never happened. And that certainly happened with my jump room experiences.
Interesting. So you the attempt to brainwash you happened only at the end, once you left the project.
Right. I know that something was done the last time I was at the jump room building, which we know and we agree, the three of us, it was at 999 North Sepulveda Boulevard in El Segundo, California. That's where the West Coast jump room was. Bernie had more substantial experience with the East Coast jump room, and I think I was there once during my years of service, because I remember walking out of the jump room to a scene that Bernie has described for me that seems very familiar. So I know that during that last return to the El Segundo jump room building, I was taken somewhere and brainwashed, I believe, with something that was administered while language was also used to make me repress what had happened. But so much has come forward now that what the interaction between William B. Stillings and I shows is that as of the mid 80s, they were able to suppress somebody's ability to immediately recover memories about a related set of experiences, but that once two people who experience the same thing meet and begin comparing notes, all of those memory blocks start falling down, and much of what happened can be recovered.
Well, at this point, I'd like to bring Bernie in. Bernie, your situation was completely different in that you weren't a participant in the same way that Brett and Andrew were as a child and a student. You were actively in the military at this point.
That's correct. I was in detail to the military from the administration, but I did have some participation as a child with my relatives. My cousin, George, would be bringing me to these different classified locations. He was very big into the extraterrestrial project that was going on in the area around me and the different bases. And he would bring me along. I was out west someplace, out in Arizona someplace, looking at some UFOs with him when I was very young. I remember it quite vividly. And as time went on, he brought me, along for more and more training. I would take the high altitude tests, and they had a number of other tests to take. Before they actually had the jump room program, which I'm confirming that Andrew was involved in, they had other programs that would lead up to. When Andrew was involved, it was probably an upgrade of the jump room to a size of an elevator. It originally was the size of a small cylinder. A small cylinder about 2.5 feet wide by about maybe 3.5, 4 feet long. And they would put it through this elaborate machine and send it out. And they didn't know where it was going, which ended up being captured by space aliens who brought it up during the negotiations many years later. But that was part of the beginning of the jump rooms, probably during World War II and then after World War II. As time went on, they made bigger and bigger cylinders and they moved it from Philadelphia. That was Project Rainbow, which I was involved in as a young boy. And then as I got older, getting detailed usually to the Navy, because the Navy had a completely separate project. But as time went on, this is all very complicated, but there's a lot of parts to the puzzle that pull together. When I first met Andrew, I was very, very busy. I was already done some jumps in the East Coast jump room. And I didn't know there was a West Coast jump room. But I knew this project that I was involved in was very, very big. And involved a lot of people and involved a lot of different aspects to it. So at some point I was asked, because I was doing such a good job, he said, well, we want to give you a break. We want you to go out, to the West Coast jump room. You find the people out there a lot nicer because we just had a major mishap in the East Coast jump room. And, go out and meet these people out in the West Coast jump room. And I think you'll like it there. The people are a lot nicer, a lot more friendlier. So when I went out there, I was supposed to arrive early that morning. And then my orders to my escort would be Major Ed James. I said, I wanted somebody to escort me. Simply because of the fact I didn't really, I knew how to do the jumps well, but I didn't really know the technical part of it too well, or how to find my way around military bases too well. But I always wanted to be sure of it, because I always wanted to have an escort.
How old were you at this point?
That was in the 1980s, so I would be about 22 years old.
And again, you were brought up, essentially, not by your father, but by an older cousin, into these programs.
That's right. My older cousin was very big in this project. He got to be very big in the military. He was retired a major general in the reserves, and he was very big in this ET program. And then he just took me along. So.
But again, why would he just take you along? I mean, surely these things are quite. The security around these things is quite tight. I mean, you can't just bring family members along for the ride, can you?
Well, I was actually living at a military base with him at one time, and then because he was good friends with, he was on Douglas MacArthur, General of the Army staff during the war, and he was good friends with him. He would take me along, and there was an incident with me when I was very, very young, where I had pointed out something, and I was always pointing at things when I was a child. And I kept pointing, and then these people who raised me were very suspicious people. If you acted suspicious around them, they do something about it right away. So they actually sent a P-51 Mustang at whatever I was pointing out in the sky. And at some point in time, this P-51 actually had a collision. It was a clear blue day. There was nothing out there. It had a collision with something, and the pilot bailed out, parachuted out. Now, I was quite young at the time. And ever since then, that's how I got involved in this project. Because
So the same
apparently,
sort of story as Andrew. You displayed abilities. You could clearly see something that nobody else could see.
that has been a major concern in my life. They figured out why I could do this. It took them many years. I think they figured it out probably in the late 70s, early 1980s, when they developed a very classified machine, which they hooked me up to once. It hurt a little bit, gave me a little eye damage, not much. They could actually look into your eye through your retina and actually see the back of your eye and the whole structure of your eye, kind of like remote viewing on a small scale. And they determined that I had more rods and cones than most people. Rods and cones allow you to see at night and absorb more of the light that most people see. So I had 5 to 6 times more rods and cones. And in each bundle of rods, they were 3 to 5 times more dense than most people. So that's why I was able to see things at a greater distance, and things. I absorb more of the spectrum of light, is what it's boiling down to. And I'm able to see in the dark too, pitch dark. I've been tested at it at least 3 times. A full admiral actually came at me and accused me of cheating because he said, "Well, your family's in the military," he said, "and somebody must have trained you when you were a child, and you're cheating and you figured your way around this obstacle. But I'm going to fix your wagon right now, so I'm going to make this obstacle course so hard you'll never figure your way through it." And I did it. And he couldn't believe it. They all stood. I'll never forget the day. Petty Keel was there. I'm not sure if Troy was there or not. I know the admiral was there, and about 8 or 10 other people. They were actually there staring at me when I went through this obstacle course. And they could not believe I did this.
Do you still have this ability to see in the dark and distances, or did the process damage your eyes? Because I know you wear glasses now.
Yeah, I wear glasses now. I don't see as well as I used to. But I'm getting old. I'm pushing 60. And I can't see as well as I used to. But that's what I used to do. That was my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what led up to me going into jump rooms, amongst other things. It was detailed to a lot of different places. And, that's how I met Andrew. And my escort was like Major Dames. Very nice fellow. I was supposed to get there about 11 a.m. Actually, we figured about between 9 and 11. But I got delayed because on my way there, we had another incident. We had some power loss. And then I got told to go check it. I was going to stop by anyway, see this guy, Tom, and ask him, well, what's going on with this power loss? Because I was reading the reports at the time.
You mean power losses in the jump room?
That's correct. They're having power losses in the jump room, and nobody knew why. But so I had to stop to see Tom, ask him what he wanted. He usually wanted spare parts as usual, and then try and determine from Tom how we could locate or what was the cause of this power loss. So I had to go to Ohio to do this, and that took some doing. There was some kind of station there in Ohio. I don't know where it was. I was told it was in Ohio. Don't ask me where I was in Ohio. It was some kind of field and kind of peculiar building someplace. But I knew Tom. Tom knows me and my family. My family has go way back. And so I met Tom there, and then we talked for a while, and then he showed me around a little bit, and I asked him, what's going on with this power loss? He says he wasn't sure exactly. He wasn't sure that it was someplace further down the line and that it would take a lot of people to narrow it down. He says, well, I think we're going to have to do this eventually because we're having such intermittent problems and they get more and more frequent and everyone was getting concerned and we got to, nail this down. Everyone, I was told from administration to tell them that, we want to nail this problem down. And so he said he would get enough manpower together and put together a plan that we can put enough people in position to find out where this power was. So that's why I got to the West Coast Jump Room late. By that time, I was very tired, I had already been up 2 days because I had to go through briefings and debriefings, which I didn't realize I had to do, talking about the West Coast jump room. And the reason why I was delayed because the East Coast jump room had a mishap, and I had to get a debriefing about that. So by the time I get out there, it was late in the afternoon. I was in the hallway. I was talking to Major Ed Dames. He showed me around a little bit. He says, you know, I said, I'm going to spend the weekend here. I'm going to spend the next few days, and I'm going to take it easy. And he says, you know, we were talking about the mishap. Apparently, you knew something about what's going on in the East Coast jump room. And then I remember as we were standing in the hallway talking, and we went outside back and forth. I never, you know, Andrew came into the room, sat down. A few other people in the room sit down. And he said, well, just about everybody's here. Let's go in the room. And we all sat down. I sat in the front. Andrew remembers, for some reason, Andrew can remember exactly where I sat in the room. And so can Brett. I can't remember exactly where I sat in the room. It sounds familiar. And then we began, you know, to talk about it. It was late in the day, and he said we weren't going to jump that day because there was some kind of power failure. And then eventually went over to the barracks, and we went to sleep. And one of the last things I remember is laying in one of the barracks bed, and the Andrew was on top, and I went out cold. You know, I was that tired. I hit the fresh, cold country air, and I just went out.
No, actually, Bernie, you're confusing our training at College of the Siskiyous with the night run where we stayed at that barracks over near the El Segundo jump site. But I do remember meeting you when you were conversing with Major Dames when some of us came back from a break. I remember you showing up several days after the rest of us, and I also remember, and this is something that Brett remembers too, I don't think he discussed it in his appearance on your show, Lisa, and that is that Bernie was introduced to us by Major Ed Dames in uniform. And I remember that Ed said, sometimes the government, to find out what's going on in a project or agency, will take an investigator and drop them into the program as a participant. And that's what Bernie's doing. He's actually joining our training, and then you'll sometimes see him or work with him in the field because he has a set of questions he's trying to answer as an investigator. And Ed didn't tell us what they were. We now know they were things like what was happening with this casualty account, how was it that some victims were recovering their full faculties after apparently dying or being grievously injured during the jumps, and where in fact were the jump room taking the jumpers. So Brett and I remember Bernie being introduced to the class as essentially, he looked to us like an Army intelligence officer, sort of. He had kind of a green uniform on with epaulets on his shoulders. So he was kind of set off as somewhat different than certainly the 10 teenagers that were the trainees. And of course, there were sometimes 3, sometimes 4 parents present. We have the identity of those people. So Bernie was kind of viewed as somewhat of a different apple altogether in the sense that he was introduced to us not really as one of our fellow chrononauts, but as an investigator of the program.
So does that mean your father and Brett's father were usually in the training room, classroom with you?
Well, we've identified 5 of the 10 young people. So in addition to myself and William B. Stillings, the 3 that we've identified were Barack H. Obama, who is now the President of the United States, then using the name Barry Soetoro, Regina E. Dugan, who was then attending Caltech, who until very recently was the first female director and 19th director, historically speaking, of DARPA, the very U.S. agency that gave the U.S. its time-space capability, and William Cameron McCool, who at age 35 in 1996, another one of our same-age peers, would go on and be admitted to the Space Shuttle Corps and tragically die as the pilot of Space Shuttle Columbia upon its entry into Earth's atmosphere on February 1st of 2003. So those were the 5 young people of the 10 that we've been able to identify. But the 3 parents who were virtually at every lecture were my father, Raymond F. Basiago of Parsons, you know, the former chief technical liaison between Parsons and the CIA on teleportation. So I guess my dad qualified because he had some sense of how the jump room was working or may have stayed on top of that literature as of the $1 a year man for the Defense Department on teleportation and processes like it. Brett's father, Thomas J. Stillings, was then an operations analyst at the Lockheed Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California. And then Barry's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, who was then working for the U.S. Agency for International Development, we believe as a cover for her espionage on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency, was also at virtually every class meeting. In fact, Stanley Ann Dunham gave us an excellent afternoon lecture on cross-cultural communications. And I remember she cited the fact that it was germane to her own life because in the past she had been married to husbands, one of whom was from Kenya and the other who was from Indonesia. And I remember that Barry actually didn't attend his mother's lecture. So she actually lectured one afternoon about how to relate to people from different backgrounds. And I guess that was in the event that we interacted directly with any Martians on the surface. And then sometimes Regina's mother was there, but very infrequently. And so it's our surmise that several parents who were directly tied to the CIA, namely my father, Brett's, and Barry's mother, were maybe being groomed as sort of docents for the program, or maybe they were adults that we could go to in Southern California in the event that something happened in the program.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, we were living in Chatsworth. My father was working in Pasadena. The Stillings were living in La Cañada, and Tom Stillings was working in Burbank. Barry was attending Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, which is a suburb of Pasadena. And Regina was attending, she was from Virginia, but she was attending Caltech, so maybe her mother had actually moved west and was in the area as well. But we think that may have actually been part of the program, as they were sort of in training to be adult facilitators for the jump room program.
So let's move on to where you believe you were actually going to. Now, from what I understand, when you and Brett got together and started comparing notes, you were both convinced that you were physically visiting the planet Mars. There was no question. But the appearance of Bernie seems to add some more information to this and some other possibilities. Am I right so far?
Yes, let me, if I might cover what convinced us it was Mars, and then that'll give the background for how we reformulated that it may have been Mars, some kind of synthetic quantum environment that was not Mars, or maybe it involved both accessing Mars and then sometimes accessing an artificial environment. But let's just give the background on Mars.
Does this also, when you give this background, does this tie into the mishaps?
Well, I can share some of what Ed Dames said that Bernie was certainly privy to that indicated that something strange was going on. Mm-hmm. So that at the classroom. But even before we got to the classroom, what happened is, independent of each other's fathers and not having met each other yet in life, Brett and I were both invited by our fathers to go camping with our dads on the same weekend at the campground at Lake Siskiyou. And both Brett and I had previously camped in the Shasta region, including at that lake, with our fathers and our mothers and siblings. So it was a region that we were both familiar with. The first strange thing that happened, I don't know if Brett narrated this, but we were both driven first to a market in McLeod, California, and our fathers told us to stay in the car. They would be out in about 15 minutes, and they both came out with like a 3 to 5 day growth of beard. So independent of each other, Brett and I both knew by the time our dads had reached the McLeod market on the way from Southern California to the campground that our fathers had done something involving time travel before our experiences even began, because we thought we were just going on summer vacations with our dads. Then my dad and I got to the campground there at Lake Siskiyou first. The Stillings arrived about an hour or two later. And when they first came over and started interacting with us, the first thing that Tom Stillings said to my father was, you may know me. We work for the same company, which was kind of like a CIA code talk. And he very quickly started talking about the company and sort of engaging in spook speak, almost to sort of rein me in to be interested in what he was talking about. And the first strange thing that happened at the campsite, in fact, this was what Brett had first contacted me about, what he remembered, and then I shared it during my second appearance on Coast on November 11th of 2010, about 7 months after Brett had contacted me in April of 2010, which is that his father took a piece of metal out of a box from their distinctively pumpkin-colored Volkswagen van, like a shoebox, and it was about maybe 3 inches wide and about 6 inches long, and he showed me how he could make it hover above the ground and explained that it was a boundary layer material. In fact, it wasn't having an anti-gravitic effect. It was having a reverse magnetic effect vis-a-vis the mineral deposits in the earth. Okay, so the first strange thing was this little science demonstration that Tom Stillings did. The next strange thing is that promptly at about 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, the second day we were there, in adjacent campsites, Brett and his father came over to our campsite again, and we gave them some lawn chairs to sit on. And right at 1 o'clock, they both got up and walked across the campgrounds to a campsite that was 4 or 5 sites up the road. And there was a camper and a truck parked in the front of the campsite. And Brett and I were walking ahead of our fathers, I guess being rather limber in our teens. And we were greeted by a relatively celebrated member of American society in the front of his campsite. It was astronaut Buzz Aldrin. And he looked at Brett and I, and we had no idea that he was going to be there or that we were going to meet one of the astronauts during this summer camping trip with our fathers. And he looked at us, and he knew our names. He said, "Brett, Andy, let me tell you, you're going to be," he said, "you're going to be doing something that I did a little while back, which is going off planet. And let me tell you, boys, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime." And Brett and I were flabbergasted because we're having sort of this little out-of-body experience walking across the campground and meeting Buzz. And we just kind of chit-chatted for 5 or 10 minutes there, and he shook our hands, and then we walked back to our campsite. So I think that obviously was a setup to prepare us psychologically for what my father was going to share that night at 10 o'clock around the campfire. The campfire is raging. We're looking up at the beautiful Milky Way galaxy above us in that perfect air that you get around Mount Shasta, where you can see thousands and thousands of stars in one glance. And my father announced that, he said, "Boys, you're going to be taking some classes tomorrow." And I was 18, Brett was 13. And so I did a lot of the talking. I said, "Dad, what are you talking about? I thought we were going to have some fun on this trip. I just finished my first year of college." And he said, "No, you're going to be taking a astronomy related course up at the college beginning tomorrow morning."
Astronomy related.
I said, "Astronomy? What are you talking about? I just covered my breadth requirement in astronomy at UCSD. I'm not going to I don't want to become an astronaut. I'm going to be majoring in history in the fall at UCLA. What is this about?" He said, "Well, it's going to be a seminar, everything to do with Mars." And I said, "Mars? Why would we come up here to be enrolled in a class about Mars rather than going fishing, Dad, or water skiing or something? This is really odd." And he looked at me and then at Brett, and he said, rather soberly actually, "Because some of you children in the program," he actually said, "you kids, some of you kids in the program are going to be going there." And Brett and I looked at each other like, "Oh my God, what have our fathers implicated in us in now?" Because we had both had these strange one-off father and son experiences where they had literally involved us in the ongoing research and development activities of the classified defense-related, community, the aerospace industry, which was particularly evident in Southern California. I mean, people like the Aldrins might be your neighbors, Buzz's daughter, Jan, sang at my sister's wedding in June of 1980. Brett would go on and know Buzz in a fraternal organization in Southern Cal. So with every other household being, the father being, usually the dad, being connected in some way to the aerospace community, it wasn't really that strange to be around those subjects. I mean, my dad had shown me the schematics for the lunar landing in 1967 because he almost worked on the instrumentation before it went from Parsons to Jacobs or Grumman or whoever worked on the LEM. But anyway, it wasn't really that odd to be around dads who might show you something like the boundary layer material, but to hear from my dad the notion that we were not only going to be in an academic program that summer, but that some of us were going to be going to Mars was like, it was just bizarre.
Even in your world, it was bizarre.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly not in theirs. You know, we've had the slip by astronaut Eugene Cernan that he's done it twice now on CNN that Buzz wants to go back to Mars. So wasn't that strange in their world to be talking about Mars? So the next morning, we went up and actually we didn't attend class at the Weed, California main campus of College of the Siskiyous. We went up to their extension building in Yreka, California, which looks a lot more like a prison than a university. And that's where Brett and I were threatened with being tortured in the event we talked about the program. So here we have the 10 young people, some of their parents. There were 2 of the teenage participants who were threatened to not talk about what we experienced. And Brett and I were literally taken out of that room, believing we were going to be taken into the next room and tortured. When all that happened is a military officer stood there with a kind of a wild, mad professor in a white jacket, and he spoke in a very quiet voice saying, "Boys, you cannot talk about this program. This is absolutely top secret, and it could be a national security disaster if you talk about this." Okay, so we had a couple really kind of scary sessions there at that campus, and then we began meeting every day, I think at around 8:30 to about 2:30 in the afternoon, for a set of classes that basically consisted of a factual seminar given by Major Danes that was preparing us in terms of what we should know about Mars. It was simply a set of factual statements that he was lecturing on, and he would talk for 3 or 4 sentences and make a joke. So he covered things like, the ancient history of Mars, the conditions on Mars, in the contemporary era, predators on Mars, what the natural conditions were, and some of the side effects of our stay there, some of which we experienced. For example, I experienced intense hypoxia with massive cramping in the legs from the deficient oxygen levels there.
I take it whatever they were telling you was contrary to what you would have learned formally in school.
Yes, we were apprised of the fact that Mars had a humanoid population consisting of 3 major typologies, and then we were introduced to about 30 known animal species, about 5 or 6 or 7 that were predators, and several predators that they showed us that if we were in the immediate proximity of, we could not evade. So we were actually shown the predators that would almost inevitably eat us in the event that they focused on us in our immediate environment. Mm-hmm. And it was for that reason that ultimately I was provided a flash gun and a suicide pill to either try to defend myself against a particular predator or to end my life so that I wasn't there at the point that I was being consumed by one of the predators that was most fleet of foot and vicious and that we wouldn't be able to evade. So it was pretty much a factual seminar. One thing that was recovered after I began to appear in the media with Brett and also by myself and certainly with Bernie talking about the training program and then our experiences on Mars, or SQE Mars, as we call the synthetic quantum environment, if that explains where we were sent, is that toward the end of the program, Barry Soetoro, who we now know as Barack Obama, Regina Elvira Dugan, and I were approached by Ed Danes and my father, and it was explained to us that we were going to be teleported to the beginning of the summer, and we were going to be sequestered there in the dorms, working on providing our thesis, basically our hypothesis, about whether or not the Martian humanoid population presented a threat to Earth. So Barry, Regina, and I were sequestered. We went forward in time. We were essentially, at one point, Barry and I were rooming with each other, and then we were in separate rooms. But we were basically given this 4 inches of data, CIA data, on the earthly humanoid population on Mars. These would be the descendants of the Earthlings on Mars from the time before the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, when the Earth and the Mars humanoid civilizations were separated. So that particular typology of Martian humanoid possesses space flight, has been to our planet, as my experiences in Pegasus indicate, was in liaison with our aerospace community in the early 70s.
Can you repeat what you just said for me about who these Mars humanoids are, where they came from?
Yeah, there's three humanoid typologies on Mars. The first one I call Homo Maris Terris. Those are the Earthling type Homo sapiens that are the descendants of the Earthlings that were on Mars prior to the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, which ended the great maritime civilization on Earth that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx.
Right.
That civilization was interplanetary, and so Earthians and Martians, our ancestors and theirs were separated at that point, but they're still essentially Homo sapiens. They're Homo sapiens that have evolved in a genetic niche with a breeding population of about 1 million. So they're more narrowly genetically sectored than Homo sapiens on Earth are, but they're basically our genetic relatives. They're our cousins on Mars. That is a spacefaring civilization. The second typology, and they were in liaison with our aerospace community in the early 70s. My father and I met 3 of those Martians as they were leaving a technical briefing at Curtiss Wright in the summer of 1970 to go back to Mars in their craft. The second type, I do not believe, are spacefaring. They wear black caftans, both the adults and the children. And that's the typology that I call Homo Maris Maris. That's the original Martian typology, and that's the typology that has given its phenotype that in the understanding on Earth of what a Martian is, which is a humanoid that's slighter than us, shorter, has a longer head, pointier ears, longer fingers, and a very kind of frightened, recondite personality. That's a separate typology of humanoids, and I saw a number of those at the point in my jump room experiences where I was bringing a data disk from the jump room infrastructure that we called the corkscrew to a communications post that had been cobbled together deep in this urban ruin that was essentially consisted of a set of dilapidated brick buildings. But that Martian typology, whether it was their children or an adult, were frequently looking out at me as I would cross through that city, that dilapidated city, from behind a doorway, for example, to see who this humanoid was, or Earthian, if they could figure out where I was from, that was walking past the dilapidated building that they were living in or that they were using to access the surface from the underground. And then the third typology of Martians I call Homo Maris Extraterrestrialis, which are essentially indistinguishable from the gray extraterrestrials. And Bernie recalls how one time we came out of the jump room and there was one up on the roof observing us. Okay, so they're either grays that are simply staying on Mars, or they are the remnant of some gray visitors to Mars who left their progeny on Mars and have been evolving independent of space flight on the Martian surface. And I don't believe those 3 populations can reproduce because they're fairly well established, for example, in their phenotype. So presumably that's not an interbreeding population of 3 subspecies of the human race, but in fact, only the first species are literally Homo sapiens.
And do the 3 of these species live separately from each other? Do they interact? Do they socialize? Or are they completely separate social structures?
I was briefed by a career CIA officer after I published my paper in December of 2008. I was contacted early January 2009 and told that my paper tracked the reality very well. And this individual explained that the Martian humanoid population consists of 1 million individuals. It lives primarily underground, and it's cooperative. So at the same time, we've been told that Martians, the ones that I call Homo Maris Maris, the original humanoid population.
The ones in the black caftans.
Yeah, the ones in the black, the ones that might be the inspiration for Kewpie dolls. Have you ever seen Kewpie dolls on Earth?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stereotype of the Martian. You know, the Martian is having a bald head, pointy ears, a long black cloak. We were told that we should be wary of that group because they were usually nonviolent, but occasionally they engaged in opportunistic predation and would actually kill a humanoid from Earth and, you know, barbecue them. So we should be concerned about being jumped by a group of them. So I was always very wary as I was walking through that city, kind of like you would be crossing a yard where there was a vicious dog that you were concerned at not provoking into attacking you. So I was always very somewhat wary of that particular type of Martian. The extraterrestrial type was altogether very much like what people encounter during during UFO contact experiences. But the type that is like us is spacefaring. So in this sort of colloquium that Barry and Regina and I were dropped into, this seminar within the seminar, we were given about 4 inches of briefing documents from CIA, and we spent several months drafting our thesis of whether or not that population presented a threat to human civilization on Earth. And I remember that we weren't supposed to discuss our findings as we were writing our theses, but as we were walking over to deliver them to Ed Dames and then rejoin our group in real time, I revealed that I had concluded that we were projecting our own fears on a population that we were territorially aggressing against. Regina became very angry at me and said, "What about the incident where we asked them to save some of our astronauts and they abandoned them and they died on the surface?" So she felt that they were at least not just indifferent, but uncaring and presumably hostile to the survival of human life on Earth, to Earthling life on Mars, I should say. And Barry, destined as he was to become a future politician of fairly high standing, declined to say anything. He walked his thesis all the way over to Ed Dames without revealing to us what he had decided. He had probably taken a middle of the road position that we should view them as potentially friendly but also potentially hostile.
A true politician even then.
Yeah. So there was a kind of a seminar within the seminar, and individuals who would be headed for Harvard Law School, Caltech, and Cambridge, which is to say Barry, Regina, and I, somehow were selected out of that group of chrononauts from that Mars training program and asked for our opinion of what the data showed before we even went up. And that's a detail of that summer experience that was obviously deeply embedded. And it was funny, again, the whole issue of retrocausation and how it's almost like something out of Get Smart, when program administrators try to explain the complications of time travel to time travelers, certainly an individual like me who hadn't time traveled since childhood. He says, and I know you meet me there, and I know that you get there to the beginning of the summer because I've already met you there. So in other words, Ed is in August on his timeline, and he's explaining to us that we're going to be teleporting back to the beginning of the summer. And he says, I know you get there safely because I've already met with you. to start the CIA threat assessment on the Martian humanoid civilization. So that's how strange the true history of our planet becomes. Not only does the American and world population not know or doesn't want to face the fact that President Obama in all likelihood was born in Hawaii of an American mother, and probably an African-American father, but that he was in the secret space program as a young man. He provided analytical data to the CIA about whatever threat was posed by the Martian humanoid population, and he was one of our fellow chrononauts when we began going there via a revolutionary time travel technology. And here we now have 3 witness participants who know each other, agree with each other's accounts, and are now presenting this information publicly. And it has not yet entered the world's understanding of reality. And that's why I think we're having this interview today.
So what did Bernie bring to the table? What added information did he bring? And why the questions now about whether some of your jump room experiences were maybe not to physical mass?
Well, I think maybe Bernie can follow up on that because he was essentially tasked with investigating where we were going and what was happening that would explain the kind of casualty figures that, Ed Dames told us during the training program, that is not just Bernie and I, but the class, that of the 97,000 people that we've sent to Mars, only 7,000 have survived after 5 years. So maybe Bernie can pick it up and explain what he was asked to find and then what he did find, and why we now have this alternate explanation for where we were jumping.
97,000 is a huge figure
I
to
know.
be involved in this project.
Right, but I remember Bernie quoting the fact that a very large figure had been cited of people who supposedly were killed on the surface, but then there were experiences where people would be torn apart by a dinosaur-like creature, and their remains would be left somewhere on the surface, and then they'd walk up to the jump room and ask to be sent back to Earth. So I think Bernie's more qualified to answer that, because it was his finding that led to the conclusion that at least some of the time we weren't going to Mars.
That's correct. When I first met Andrew, and I didn't know about the West Coast jump room, and I was doing work for the Navy and for the East Coast jump room, we were coming up upon problems and reading, there were like 40 to 50 reports per month just before I met Andrew. And about the time I met Andrew, it went up to 70 reports per month. Now, the administration, those guys there, had done this for about 15 years or so.
These are 40 or 50 reports of mishaps or deaths or problems.
These are reports of the jumps themselves, the personnel, any casualty reports would be included in that. They were there no matter what, once per month, sometimes twice per month, and then from different locations. And then they would be summarized. And the administration I was working for, the people that were there were doing this a very long time, so there were a lot of parts they really didn't want to contend with. There were certain things they were very interested in all the time. So we take all this war intelligence, rework it, and summarize it, and present it to the administration at the time. But that's not to say there's a lot of other details that were missed that were passed on laterally. This information would go upline and sometimes laterally a lot. Mm-hmm. So that everyone involved would know that we need parts and supplies, equipment, more training, or some other issue that would come up. So I had read all these reports. I mean, after you read 40 or 50 of them, there must have been 300-400 reports laying around. They all have like a common theme. A lot of common things are happening, but casualties are growing. And see, these jumps weren't that frequent before I met Andrew. And when Andrew was training and I was told I was going to go to the West Coast, there were people out in the West Coast, they were almost ready to jump. They were getting ready to jump, but they hadn't jumped already because they didn't really know, because the way this whole thing's so classified, so compartmentalized. And they're in training too, and then you'll be given a briefing and brought up to speed of what they're doing, and then go out there and jump with them. But summarization of these reports led to the conclusion that we would jump into different places. Now, how are you going to tell where this place is? So that was a question, which I brought to the astrophysicist or the physicist. There were no, actually there were astronomers and physicists, and then later on, as time went on, it became astrophysics. And I posed this question to them, and they suggested I speak to the astronauts about it too. So I said, okay, I'm going to get appropriated funds. You're going to work on this question. Let's see if we can get this done right away, because we were doing more and more jumps. We get more and more reports. We had creatures, we had sightings, we had different locations. Somebody claimed it was off planet, so we had to get things done right away. So I went and talked to the astronauts, and some of them that I met with, they're saying, we got this contract, which they did. And then I said, we got this problem. We got to get it done right away. So they went down and talked to somebody at the Skunk Works down at NASA, and they got these homing devices. I'm sure Andrew remembers the homing devices. They were like big domes. Some of them weighed 80 pounds or 100 pounds. Some are bigger, some are smaller, and they could roll along. We brought them with us. Now, these homing devices would intermittently flash a red light beam and send out a signal or on command. And I know I must have placed 8 or 10 of them myself. I don't know where we were placing them, but where we were jumping to. So that was one way we're going to determine where these locations were. Then I went back to the Navy and posed a question to them. Where are we going to? So the problem was that they were attempting to hook up video cameras to the jump rooms. And the problem was that they didn't work. So, believe it or not, Hughes' people contacted me. I think it was Howard Hughes himself. It sounded like I was talking to him over the phone. And he said that, I think I can lick this problem. I says, well, and this is a very elaborate story. I felt that with discussions with the gray creatures, that they were going to give us a short period of time where we could jump like this. I didn't think this would go on forever. I was sure of it then, but I had really no proof. I was just talking to them. They said, well, we're going to let you see things for now. So Hughes' people came through with
You're saying the Greys said this?
Well, at some point in time after that, we actually sat down and negotiated with them.
Have you physically sat down in the same room with them?
I was actually at one of the areas. I was on my way home, and before I left, I had discussed the possibility of sitting down, per the instructions of the administration, to talk to these bird creatures. There were 3 different groups that were there, and I was talking to 1 or 2 of the groups in the room, standing up. And I said, we want to sit down with you and negotiate things. We want to talk with you, and we have many questions. There are many people that have questions from our government, and they were starting to understand what our government was about, and the Allies, the British, and the rest of the Allied alliance. We want to sit down with you. We want some representatives and sit down and talk with you. We have a lot of questions. We also have a lot of other incidences where spaceships are crashing or the spaceships violating our space. So I think that was at the beginning of the day. I was mentioning that to them. Then towards the end of the day, about late in the day, 3, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, I was going to catch the late flight home, and because I was getting tired, I was already up 2 or 3 days. And for some reason, they came back and said, we will sit down right now immediately and negotiate with you. The ship actually pulled up outside between the hangars. And they actually set up a table. He sat down and said, we will answer all your questions as best we can. And that's how this negotiation started. And we did ask some questions about the jump rooms, amongst a lot of other things. I know at one point I had to go lay down for a couple hours because I was up a very long period of time. So I went to lay down for a few hours. I think it was a British, little British contingent that was there. I think it was the Duke himself. I mean, I saw pictures of him years later. This looks like this guy who was a Duke. And he began talking with them. And I'll never forget it. They woke me up about almost 2 hours later, or an hour later. And I just woke up and I got up and I said, you have to go out there. There's a problem. Go talk to them. So I got up. I could see the look on the Duke's face. His eyes were bulging out of his head. And he had this very peculiar look, and he walked away. And apparently, they had said something that was very disturbing to him. But we discussed the jump rooms as to where we were going. And one of them, they didn't know what we called the planets. That's another issue. We had a lot of things like that we wanted to settle. We wanted to show them what our planet was, the surrounding planets were, and what they called them. Because apparently our jumps, and based on the reconnaissance at the time, the descriptions of what Mars was like was matching the descriptions of the jumps and the reconnaissance. But it wasn't technically correct. Now today, and that's why Andrew's speaking to me, I stepped forward, a lot of reconnaissance of Mars matches the descriptions, pictures and films, and other reconnaissance of Mars. And it's a very close correlation. So when we had these jumps, and we were beginning of these jumps, the jump room was getting bigger, and Andrew was in the most advanced jump room of the time on the West Coast. There would be further advancements. And Hughes' people were building cameras because we couldn't see where we were going from the point we left, the jump, to the point we touched down. And then when the doors opened, we would go out, whatever it lasted, 30 seconds, a minute, minute and a half, 3 minutes, however long you can hold your breath and run back and then jump back. We couldn't see that intermittent part. But users, people eventually figured this. Now, wherever we went, and I noticed wherever I jumped, I always saw a gray creature. And I always saw him, I always had a witness or two that saw the same thing I did. Now, I don't know why these gray creatures were there, and that's what ultimately led to these negotiations with them. Because as we were jumping, and it was always asking me, did you see one of those white guys? We just call them white guys sometimes. They were basically the gray creatures. Mm-hmm. And what they were doing there, they would always be looking at us or peering at us through like a big porthole, or we'd be moving along this kind of like conveyor system, and we would see them standing there looking at us. This was later confirmed that they were always there. And that's what led up to the negotiations, which led up to all these theories as to where we were going. Now, how are you going to prove that? That's what I led up with the Fermi team and with the astronauts. We got to prove where we're going. The other thing we were doing is we were leaving things behind. So we jump someplace. That's correct. We'd leave something that couldn't be easily duplicated, which would be left in a place, which would eventually be found. So if someone else went to this location, say, and actually went in a rocket ship, went to Mars, they would eventually find it. And they'd say, on this date, so-and-so, these people came to this location via jump room. And that's what we were doing. Besides that, we were trying to upgrade equipment and began testing based on the astronauts' plan to bring back specimens of the dirt, specimens of the rock, specimens of the trees and the flowers and the fauna. And we began developing a program around that. And this got very elaborate. The major thing we were worried about was what kind of atmosphere was there. And now we didn't really know what kind of atmosphere was there. We tried to take oxygen with us, but that was a little difficult because of what, and Andrew could really explain this really good. They called it, I didn't know what the word was until I met Andrew, and then years later we talked about this, morphing, where things will become disfigured, metal things or other things. So if you took a cylinder of oxygen with you, it would explode. Or somebody said they can take a smaller cylinder of oxygen, make it 1/3 full, and it wouldn't explode. But at some point, these cylinders are very big, very cumbersome, and what's the point of taking 1/3 oxygen? Mm-hmm. But eventually, we were getting over these problems of bringing oxygen with us and determining what oxygen was there and determining what was there. Now, when I met Andrew, and he mentions the critical night jumps, we were running into creatures. Now, the official report I sent in at the time, I was going to say what I thought they were, and I was advised not to say that. All you can say is you saw 2-legged creatures or 4-legged creatures, that's all, and nothing else. And I agreed with it. Until at such time as we figured out how to get lighting down there, changed the lighting, and began, because nothing worked electrically. We actually brought flashlights down there. They worked for a very short period of time, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and then they just died out.
Was it the jump room process itself that was sort of disabling everything, or was it the environment once you got there?
Well, Brett had a fairly good explanation. Apparently, the environment itself and the jump room process, mainly the environment, when you got there, de-energizes things. Mm-hmm. Unless you wrap it in some kind of copper coating so that everything is kind of like sealed in a layer of tin, a layer of copper. That usually held it together pretty good. But that's just the gravity and the magnetics of the world versus our world. Our world is not very stable magnetically. You notice you notice the shift in the north magnetic north, and the gravity isn't very stable. But these places were very stable that way. We did some magnetic testing, and it was very stable. It was always the same temperature. It was always the same. The pressure changed a little bit. The pressure changed coming and going between these jumps. And eventually we were getting closer and closer to determining where we were going. And at some point, it appears we were going in what later became termed like the inner Earth. We were going inside the Earth somehow. Now, this was unprecedented. Apparently, Admiral Byrd's expedition to the Antarctica led to an area where he went inside the Earth.
Yes, I've read those reports.
Okay, some of them are still classified, but apparently this did happen. I've spoken to people in the Navy said that did happen. And apparently there was another expedition to the North Pole where there's another entrance into the Earth. But that hasn't been completely confirmed. But I do know there's an area in the North Pole that jet airliners and pilots do not go anywhere near for fear of not returning. So they don't want to screw with this area.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as to what this all meant at the time, and that's all we knew at the time, we were going to these areas. According to the Fermi team, it's just a place. There's no proof it is Mars, no proof it isn't Mars. Mars at the time that we were making these jumps was not in position. But he didn't discount the possibility that it could be Mars, that we were arriving there through some other means, through some other conveyance, through some other system that was unknown to us. And that's pretty much where we left it.
So hang on, you're saying the jump room was being intercepted in some way?
Now, that conclusion I came to sometime either just before I met Andrew or just after, and I wasn't the only one to come into that conclusion. Another astronaut, and I'm not going to give you his name because they're very private people, and I don't blame them, came to the same conclusion. He was involved in the jump room program. And he wrote a very similar paper to mine that something was interfering with this. Something was directing us, that we weren't directing it. And I had a big argument with an admiral or two over this, especially this British admiral. I had a very big argument with him, and I challenged him to prove me wrong by the fact of disproving me. I said, let's go to the jump room right now, and let's go to this location right now. And if we jump to this location right now, I'll keep my word. We actually did this, and we couldn't get there. I said, now how come we can't get there? Because we are not in control of this jump room. Somebody is guiding us along this jump room.
So it worked when it was allowed to work by an external source, and it didn't when it wasn't, and that's how it appeared to you?
That was my assessment and my report to the administration. And this came up in negotiations when we sat down with them and asked them for explanations for a great many things. And one of them was what was going on in this jump room besides Project Rainbow. There's another issue with Project Rainbow. There were things lost in Project Rainbow, which they had, which they determined that we sent out into their space somehow, which we shouldn't have known about. And that's where these conflicts started. We were invading their space, believe it or not. So we asked them about this. And we,
So hang on, let's back up a bit. They accused the military of invading their space under Project Rainbow, and if that was the case, then the military weren't doing it intentionally, it was somehow accidental. But
that's correct.
As a bit of a tit for tat, they were potentially interfering with the jump room program.
That's correct. That's what they said to us during these negotiations. And we had some time where the tension broke. We milled around. We walked outside. We were talking to them. What they said to us was this. They said, due to Project Rainbow, that they noticed we were coming into their space, and they actually located where Project Rainbow originally started, almost down to the last square mile. They were in the area. They actually saw UFOs in the area where Project Rainbow started. So they packed up Project Rainbow and moved out of town. But they were there. That's how their civilization is, as far as determining where this device came from. That's how advanced they are. They said that as a result of that, and as a result of these jump rooms, which were mainly on the experimental side, they said that eventually, and this was the feeling of the three civilizations, that advanced civilization that we were dealing with in the areas at the time, based on the administration's policy and positions on policy, these aliens, advanced civilization, felt that eventually we would do this. Eventually we would enter their space. And eventually, regardless of what they did, we would jump. So they felt that they should bring us along and show us things that would look familiar to us, or things we would relate to. So when we would jump and they were guiding us along, bringing us to places that was familiar to us, like Mars, the moon, or some other environment with these creatures, aka dinosaurs, or some other elaborate jungle scene, or desert scene, or pyramid scene. I mean, there must have been 100, and plus the slots out there, and all these other ancient civilization type things, like the Lincoln jump, and there was a couple other jumps. I can't remember them right off the top of my head. But all these.
Sorry, it makes it sound like they were trying to sell this to you as they're helping you, but 90,000 people were lost during this program. How much help is that?
That was looked into by the administration. I had to sign a statement that I did look into casualties. We had casualty reports all the time. There was no casualty report of 96,000 people. And the administration was very concerned. And they went to great strides and to great pains to look every conceivable place for where this happened. And there was no confirmation of this report that I could find at the time. I even signed a statement to that effect. And I was very reluctant to sign a statement because I didn't believe that could be possible. As to when this happened, I don't know. As to where it happened, I don't know. But apparently something like that happened. It's just some kind of rumor. But it is some kind of sick rumor. Mm-hmm. Now, we asked some questions like, besides all this thing, we actually requested an historian, which I did request, given the history of the galaxy, the solar system, our planet, the moon, the Mars, this whole system we live in, and the planet, and the history of the Earth and all its peoples, and how we arrived here, and the point of origin of the pyramids, and why there's so much abundance of life here on Earth. I mean, apparently some of these other planets are very homogeneous. Like, for instance, I would say, let's take a particular country. I don't know where to start this without seeming somewhat prejudiced. Let's take New Zealand. Would there be a planet of just New Zealanders? You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
That's a very homogeneous planet. Or planet of people from South Africa. One planet, all South African type people or biological types. We're a very mixed civilization, and we're very diverse as far as all the trees and the flowers and the insect life and all the birds and all the mammals. All these other planets aren't as diverse as we are. So I was asking for an explanation of that. And they began talking about this catastrophe that Andrew mentioned. Now, he mentioned 9600 BC. They didn't give me an exact date because they can't translate from their way of measuring time to our Julian calendar, which is based on the solar day. But this was requested. And this is like a very long time ago. So it could be 9,600 years back from now, less 2,000 years, which would be 7,600 BC, or just 9,600 years BC. We're not, that has yet to be confirmed, but
Okay.
it might some year. But they don't really consider that a major point because it's very difficult for them to get all these different logs from different ships and personal logs and from different planets, get it all translated, and then rehash it for us. They don't feel that's really something they should expend a great deal of resources in.
Gotcha.
They feel that we should spend our time considering other possibilities and considering other things that are more of a priority to them. Do you have a question?
No.
Well,
Keep going.
okay. And as far as this linear and nonlinear time, speaking to the most brilliant minds I could muster at the time, and I mustered quite a bit, there were two theories about time, linear and nonlinear. Linear meant that if you go back in time and do something, you will change that timeline. Nonlinear time meant that if you go back in time and change something, there is no effect in the future. Now, none of these two theories have ever been proven, but I'll admit there's cursory evidence for both. But I propose another theory which works a little better. And a lot of people agreed with me. Even Andrew started thinking, I never thought about that. What if we went back in time, but we went to like some kind of pseudo-reality where somebody restaged the Lincoln assassinations for some reason, or someone restaged a Civil War scene, or someone restaged this thing about Jesus, or the Constitution of the United States of America in Philadelphia. What if somebody actually somehow recorded that event and saved it in a room with mannequins, and you actually went back to this room and actually relived this event? And that's what I think we're dealing with. Now, I don't know how they do this, but I've gone back to many of these places, took soil samples, actually broke pieces of the building off, actually drilled holes in the wall and took samples. And it all appears to be some sort of plastic reality. It looks like wood, but it's not. It's plastic. It looks like grass. It's not. It's plastic. It looks like a building. It's not. It's plastic. And when I was very good at this, when I went outside the building and walked around in pitch black, I'd walk 15 steps out, make a right, 15 steps that way, looked around, came back 15 steps, and walked back 15 steps. There was nothing but pitch darkness around this whole area. Now, how this is possible, I don't know. And when I say it's pitch darkness, I mean you can't see your hand in front of your face. Now, where this place was, I don't know. Or why somebody would create this reality, I don't know. But someone has recreated it. There's an atmosphere in there, and someone's maintaining it. And at the time, when I was assessing with the Office of Technology, I was saying, whose technology is this? Now, I tried to get them to nail it down time after time. And I even checked with a lot of allies, which is official or unofficial. I really didn't give a damn at the time. I was going to nail this down. And no one has ever stepped forward and said, hello, I'm with this company. I built it. No one. Or someone said, you see this area over here? We built it.
So a synthetic reenactment of a historical environment and historical scene.
They appear to be major events, yes. Historical as in major event. But lately, there was another guy was talking to me not too long ago. Apparently, it was some sort of scene of like an everyday event where cars were pulling up to a parking lot, going to a platform, waiting for a train. Now, I don't see what major event is that. So, some of these jumps, going back in time, all appear to be major events. That's the only commonality I could pull out of it. And they all seem to be some sort of pseudo-realities. And that's the best I could do at the time.
Lisa, if I might jump in here,
Yes.
Yeah.
kind of elucidate what Bernie's describing. There was always an inconsistency between claims of time travel and conventional views of physics, which include the second law of thermodynamics, which states that matter and energy in the universe seek entropy, which is a fancy word for maximum randomness or chaos. And so the conventional view of physics is that when an event happens in the present, it doesn't exist in a past that you can physically visit because it's destroyed at the moment of creation. So let's say a child fires a cap gun with a little piece of dynamite or gunpowder. There is a way of tracking that past event using chaos theory of the gunpowder exploding and little Mandelbrot turtles form smaller Mandelbrot turtles until that event, the heat, the light, what's left of the gunpowder, has extended the blast as far as it can and is just infinitely missable in the present. It's just invisible now as an event. Now, the time travel theory of quantum physics is that you can go back in time and watch the child fire the cap gun. Now, for that to exist, time cannot be a series of sequelae where different things happen and then disappear. Time has to be more like a quantum videotape that can be moved backwards and forward. But the problem with that is that we never found a handhold of how such a system is organized. For example, when we turned the chronovisors on, suddenly a non-local event came into the laboratory. When we were jumping through the teleporters, we knew we were jumping between environments on the East Coast and in New Jersey and in New Mexico, but there were slight changes of time going to like 12 hours between contemporary environments. Now, what Bernie's describing, which is germane to whether we were always visiting Mars or never were visiting Mars, and also to some of the historical environments that, for example, the children on Project Pegasus were accessing. For example, I accessed the Lincoln assassination site at Ford's Theater 5 or 6 times via chronovisor, and each time experienced a slightly different version of the same event. And Bernie went there at least once and was actually knocking on the physical infrastructure of the building to figure out why it didn't cohere with what we know about Ford's Theater from April 14th of 1865. So Bernie's theory that in going to Mars or in visiting, for example, a past event, we were accessing what I've called a synthetic quantum environment. In the case of Mars, an artificial holographic planetary domain architected by the Greys, that basically bridges the gap between our conventional view of physics and the fact that a form of time travel has been achieved, which is to say that if the past doesn't exist because it's destroyed in the moment of creation, it could have been recorded by an advanced intelligent civilization observing the Earth in real time, for example, following the events of the Civil War and who this tall guy was who was going to that magnificent building in Washington, D.C. all the time, namely identifying Abraham Lincoln, as one of the kings of our colony, from their perspective as an advanced intelligent civilization observing us. Those then could have been placed in holograms or a more advanced device than a simple hologram, a device that can model an interactive hologram of that place as a steady state system, like a holodeck, so that each time we were visiting it, we weren't visiting the past, but we were basically in a machine that was recapitulating a playing of the past and then was being altered by our unique interaction with that artificial system, which is not time travel.
Which explains why it would be slightly different each time, because it would have adapted to some degree.
Right. After all, if they sent me 5 or 6 times, or probably 6 times. In fact, on 2 of those trips to Ford's Theater, I was walking through the theater, And on my, I think it was my very first jump there, I looked to my right and I thought I was watching myself in a hallway mirror, but then my image veered to the right, and I realized I had been watching myself during a later trip. And then during one of those later trips, I looked to my left and I was watching myself in that original event. But what did happen when they sent me there is each time I was there, something slightly different happened. Like one time I saw Mrs. Lincoln walk in, followed by Abraham Lincoln, all emaciated and slumped over. He was just literally dying by April of 1865. He must have had cancer or something. We now think he may have been suffering from cancer. One time I would go to the front of the theater and there'd be a boy selling tickets, and I had to talk my way past him because we didn't print tickets. And my cover story was that my parents had already been admitted and they had purchased my ticket and I had to go join them. So the first time I went to the front ticket table there was a boy handling the tickets. The next time it was a man. The third time it was the boy with the man sitting next to him. Then I'd walk into the lobby. One time I saw this elaborately dressed man talking to a beautiful young lady, also elaborately dressed in her Sunday best. Society people who could have gotten a ticket to a play in Washington, D.C. that the President and First Lady were going to be attending. Our American Cousin, starring Laura Keene, one of the primary actresses of her time. And the next time I went through the lobby, he was talking to two women as they were walking into the play. So it was the same event scenario, but it was an event scenario that was changing slightly. Now, how could that be the prior version on the same timeline? The previous version on the same timeline would have had some kind of event integrity to it. So the notion that it was actually not the past, but a replaying of a past event that the person who has been quantum displaced from their own timeline is visiting has some currency. Because when we did the pro and con on Mars, we also found inconsistencies that supported that sometimes it seemed to be the actual Mars in real time, and other times it clearly had to be a synthetic quantum environment. So if I just might indulge that dichotomy for just a second to show how really complicated this issue of reality versus synthetic quantum environment is.
Could it have also been a past event in different timelines? Could you have actually crossed timelines, though?
Yes, that's another explanation. In fact, up until I re-met Bernie and we tried to puzzle through the inconsistencies of the Mars jumps, my explanation was that the chronovisor was sort of taking slices of the quantum hologram, just like you would slice an onion, and that one jump was the one I went to the first time, but the next jump was one next to it. And then the third jump was a third one. But then by that fourth or fifth jump, that's where they sent me to the same timeline, and that's how I could see myself in different parts of the theater walking beside myself in two of the jumps. Namely, it was the same timeline. So that was my explanation, is that we were really dealing with a quantum hologram where you have a set of both similar and dissimilar event scenarios going on, because almost as if, the great creator who created everything, the great spirit, the great Imagineer, God, if you will, is imagining the same events into existence, but in multiple thoughts. Just like when we go back and we think about a given interlude in our life. If we try to go back and think about what the vacation we went on in the summer of 1995 on Maui, the first time we think about it, we're going to think about being in a restaurant, and then the second time we think about that vacation, we're going to think about going swimming in the ocean, and then the third time maybe going parasailing or something. So really, even when we remember the past, we imagine different past timelines into existence, almost as a spontaneous function of human cognition and imagination. So my theory was that the great Imagineer was thinking multiple versions of the night Lincoln gets assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., different versions of the Battle of Gettysburg, different versions of who flew the first airplane off the surface of the Earth, and in the same way, possibly different versions of terrestrial Mars. Now, there were a number of things that indicated it was Mars in real time. One was that that's what our program administrators knew or had concluded, and that there was the event in the CIA data where they hadn't saved some of our astronauts on the surface, which bespoke the notion that those Mars explorers from Earth had gotten to Mars via a conventional device and not a jump room. Brett observed, I think you mentioned on your show, that the Martian moons Phobos and Deimos were in the right location in the sky, moving in the right direction at the right distance relative to each other. There were elements on Mars that fit an unconventional explanation for what we found. For example, we found very thin atmosphere, but enough atmosphere to survive. We now know from my findings and those of Paul Goodwin and Andrew Steck regarding the NASA data that we have found pictures from the NASA archives of blue skies on Mars, which is what Brett and Bernie and I had remembered. And blue skies are attributable to oxygen, which is a clear gas and refracts blue. So that's a contemporary finding that we can go back to support the assertion we're making that the Mars atmosphere was thin but survivable by oxygen-breathing mammals like ourselves with lungs. And things like the fact that we didn't give the conventional explanation for the Martian surface that seems to be indicated by NASA's oversaturated with red photographs, but a lot of the soils were kind of tan or salmon pinkish, kind of light salmon colored. And the fact that we encountered animals on the surface that are consistent with what we have now found 30 years later in NASA's rover data. For example, I had described on radio, going back several years now, how on my second jump with Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA, when we were walking back to the skull that indicated the access point to the underground location of one of the jump rooms we had used to get there on that jump, and on my first jump, we were chased to the opening of the skull-like structure that indicated the access point by this vicious plesiosaur-like creature, basically a creature with a bulky body, turtle-like bodies, small but fast legs, and a long neck, and a head like a horse, but with teeth in it, vicious predator. And we have found dozens of those predators, or those plesiosaurs rather, in the NASA data. But then Bernie comes, so we're thinking, my God, and Alfred Weber, supported the Mars position rather than the SQE, saying, look, if you encountered plesiosaurs on those trips, and you later found them in the Mars data, the contemporary Mars data from NASA, how close do you need it to determine that it really was Mars? Well, Bernie, in his thesis of where we were going, indicated points like the fact that Mars was in the wrong location, that Mars doesn't have a breathable atmosphere at contemporary times, that Mars is going to fluctuate between, what is it, Bernie, negative 200 degrees Fahrenheit to positive 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So we would have either been frozen to death or burned alive on the surface, that we would have had boils from solar radiation from the lack of an ionosphere, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that the omnipresence of the grays indicated itself in our forays on the Martian surface, just like they were appearing frequently back during Project Pegasus, when somebody would make, for example, a trip in the Montauk chair. When I was going forward in time to these 15 and 20-minute episodes in my own subjective future via the Montauk chair, I would sometimes see pockets of grays standing in the tunnel that I found myself in, rushing forward before colliding with content on the horizon, and then finding myself in my own future at an older age. And then when that experience would collapse, we'd wake up in the chair and describe what we had seen when we were sent to our own future. So we knew that the grays operating in what can only be described as the fourth dimension, or arguably the fifth dimension, were observing our time travel activities. Since we had no roadmaps and no signs on the way, when we stood in this elevator-like contraption and it twisted to the point where we practically passed out and got all disoriented and wanted to throw up for 5 minutes, this morphing where the whole jump room and its environment just did this big twist. And we had to count, 50 Mississippi, until it righted itself and try not to throw up while it was morphing. The bottom line is that when that door opened, we found ourselves on a planetary domain because we didn't understand what the jump room was accessing as a time travel technology. The provenance of the jump room itself was disputed. Did it come from Hughes aircraft? or from Howard Hughes's company and his own personal liaison with the Grays. And when it opened, with no street signs, only scant evidence of any civilized presence, the jump room itself, occasionally some ruins that we would encounter, some skulls that provided access points either to our underground jump rooms or to the Martian civilization underground. It was ultimately a scientific conceit, and it was prejudicial for the program to conclude that it was Mars in real time. So I think Bernie came along during the days of when we were jumping and did something really of surpassing scientific excellence. I think Bernie, as a lay investigator, not as a PhD, really asked the appropriate questions, like, how do we know this is Mars in real time? What else could it be? If these grays are always cropping up, like the one that was on the roof of the jump room when Andy, Courtney, and Brett came out, and another time when Andy, Bernie, and Regina came out of one of the jump rooms, if they were always making their presence known, how do we know they weren't controlling the environment? For example, constructing these SQEs, these synthetic quantum environments, to test our responses as Earthlings to being on the threshold of contact with the wider cosmos. That very well could have been going on. My theory is right now, my supposition right now, is I'm not siding with Brett's position that it was Mars, nor with Bernie's that it was SQEs. I think it may have been both. If we've been lied to by NASA, as Brett has pointed out, for example, they still claim that the atmospheric pressure on Mars is 8 millibar. And if it was that small amount of pressure, there's no way that the parachutes could have deployed to deliver the rover's spirit and opportunity to the Martian surface. Such an atmospheric pressure would have required a parachute the size of the continental United States. So that dog don't hunt. The atmospheric pressure on Mars felt very Earth-like to us if we were visiting Mars, but would certainly have to be hundreds and hundreds of millibars to allow for the deployment of those parachutes, as depicted in NASA's own graphic of the delivery of its Mars exploration rovers to the surface of Mars.
Isn't that the kind of anomaly that, a basic college student studying these subjects would be able to figure out?
Yes, NASA's been lying to us boldly and almost facetiously in some of the scientific data it's been giving us. And this is the basis for Brett's very valid point that, you can play cards with a card shark, but you can't guarantee not being cheated. Since NASA has lied on atmospheric pressure, maybe it's lying on temperature, on location of Mars, on on gravity. I mean, one of the odd things was that, and this was another thing that actually disproved that it was Mars, is Mars is 40% the volume of Earth. And as Bernie may recall, we weren't leaping across the Martian surface like the footage we have of the NASA astronauts on the moon. We were kind of walking with a little bit more spring in our step, but we weren't bounding. And so if that had been Mars operating under the same gravitic effects of Earth, we should have been bounding, and we weren't.
You should have been John Carter.
Yeah. And so that would have been consistent with Bernie's premise that it wasn't Mars in real time, but it was some kind of simulation that the jump room was accessing. So I think there's evidence supporting both, and I'm just really, quite frankly, I'm sitting on the fence right now thinking, this was really possibly either a put-up job by the Greys from the get-go, or it was a situation where, just as they had been intervening in other time travel probes going back to the late 60s and early 70s, that DARPA undertook, some of which I was part of, and I remember their presence in some of the locations, as Bernie has described. But then again, maybe they weren't controlling or creating the environment. Maybe, again, they were just pervading the environment, maybe sometimes misdirecting or decanting the jump room to a synthetic environment, maybe even an environment aboard one of their craft. I mean, Bernie and I remember Bernie asking Barry Obama to shoot a flare, and it hit the ceiling, it hit the sky, and bounced off. There was another time when Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA and I walked from the jump room that we called the corkscrew, because it had a kind of a conch shell or spiral structure. We walked I'd say about a quarter of a mile to the right, just out the front of that jump room infrastructure to the right, and we reached some kind of invisible fence or clear wall that we could feel was there, and we could tap on it and see it was a hard surface, but we couldn't see it and we couldn't get past it. So separate and apart from Bernie's investigation, there were findings made by people that didn't even appreciate how far Bernie had gone in his investigation, like Courtney and I, who were making independent findings that supported his premise that we were actually jumping to a synthetic environment and not to Mars in real time.
I want to just dig a little deeper into these mishaps that were being reported, the significant number of people who were involved, and yet, as you were told, had not survived past a five-year mark. And I just wanted to get some clarification about that. Did you mean teleported to Mars and were staying there for up to 5 years, or just their involvement within the program?
What Ed Dames said, what Ed Dames said after he completed a several-day lecture on the different predator species, he said something in the nature, so we're sending you to a hostile environment. Some of you in this room that go may not survive this experience, but we've selected a quality group of individuals because we know that you're the kind of individuals who would give your life for your best friend or a member of your family, a member of your team. Bernie stated that among the factors that were utilized to select us were high intelligence, a non-competitive attitude or personality, and grandiosity. So in other words, they were looking for people who had a big enough opinion of themselves to go to another planet, but who also weren't the kind of person who was going to run up a hill and brag about running up the hill before their fellow chrononauts, and who would also possess the humanity to basically, let's say, pull a predator away from others and sacrifice themselves so that the team would survive. So after describing the predators, he then said, in fact, and the chance that some of us would not survive our mission, he said, in fact, of the 97,000 people we have sent thus far, only 7,000 have survived after 5 years. And I don't think he meant inhabiting the surface. We looked around at each other like we just realized we had been brought in by our government, and in some cases our parent, into
a suicide mission?
A suicide mission, and we were joking about that during the keg party. Every night we would have a keg party. First we were staying at the dorms there at College of the Siskiyous, and then a smaller group of us were staying at the Finlandia Motel, which is in the city of Mount Shasta. And I remember us laughing the tension off each night at these keg parties as we went over the almost ludicrous things that Ed Dames had said, because in that lecture, we're now a week and a half maybe into the lectures, maybe halfway through, we've now come to understand that not only are there vicious predators on the surface, but there have been as many possibly as 90,000 casualties in the last 5 years. And interestingly, that 5-year figure, this is the summer of 1980 when we're attending this class under Major Ed Dames in Weed, California. That's an interesting town to select because, of course, they could have later used that for disinformation purposes involving allegations of marijuana use, perhaps. But anyway, so the timing is interesting. That is the 5-year mark, because Michael Relf's story of going to Mars via jump room begins in 1976, which is right what was implied in terms of the time frame by Ed's comment of 90,000 being lost in 5 years. So I think what I should do is turn it over to Bernie, because he was then presented with that question of whether or not those 90,000 lives had been lost as one of the purposes of his investigation.
Well, we covered a lot of ground so far. When I met Andrew, and there was I had a list of things I had to get done eventually. The government appropriations bill was coming up, and we had to get a list of things that were needed. For instance, we're going to concentrate more on training or equipment. And how was the training coming along? And then the report of casualties. I had a whole list of things that I had to check with where his power source, where his power drain was coming from. That was like a major question that was going on for quite some time. Where do I have my list of things that have what was going wrong on? Now, as far as these 95,000 casualties, it was never proven that there ever was that many casualties. And I don't know what they were talking about. Because I signed a statement that I checked for casualties, and the casualty report was as stated, and it wasn't 95,000. And that's all I could really do.
What was it? What was it from your perspective?
People going out on comp who were working in the facilities, things of that nature. If somebody passed away, was nothing really major that I can recall. But it wasn't. There was no figure that large. But I did know that at some point, and one of the reasons why I liked doing the jumps, it was non-competitive. It was just me versus the jump. I didn't really have to worry about somebody else coming along trying to say, well, I can jump better than you, which happens from time to time. But I don't think those people really knew what they were getting into. And so that's what I liked about it. There was a lot of teamwork involved. As far as NASA goes, now, there's a lot of contradictions. There's a lot of contradictions on the readings. Now, there's a lot of readings that NASA gets from the satellites. And there are calls from certain scientists to recalibrate the instrumentation, that it's wrong. Now, I don't have enough technical know-how behind me, but I do have a lot of experience behind me to say that it's possible that the readings are wrong. It could be possible, but there's a lot of people talking about it. Now, as far as Phobos and Dios, the two moons of Mars, Brett did make those calculations. They seem to be supported years later that we found these two moons, and they seem to be in the positions that Brett was reporting. And as far as the atmospheric conditions and the other parts of the moon, of Mars, we have photographic evidence of where we're photographing the same area over and over again, and the area appears to be changing for some reason. In other words, where the layout of the rocks are, the rocks appear to be rearranged. Now, it's possible that there's something going on in the planet that's causing this to happen, that there's different elevations inside the planet that are artificial or parts of the actual Mars civilization before this catastrophe. It's obvious the surface, we felt some sort of catastrophe. The same thing with the moon. There were buildings there. They're not there now. There's no dead bodies laying around we can find. So there was obviously a civilization on the surface of the moon and Mars, and they're not there now. They have to be someplace. I mean, you have to add up, all the parts have to equal the sum. So we have the sum. Now we're looking for all the parts. So it's possible that we went somehow to Mars, sometimes on the surface and sometimes inside the planet itself, in some sort of peculiar dome system that they have inside the planet, where there's an artificial atmosphere and part of the actual existing Mars buildings that survived. And that's probably what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a remnant of a civilization that's being put back together for some reason by many advanced civilizations.
Did you ever lose anybody just in the jump room process itself?
I've seen a lot of people get injured. In fact, we didn't have oxygen readily available. That was one of the biggest problems. I know that I wouldn't jump unless there was oxygen available. When you come back, you need oxygen. reflex of hypoxia. See, sometimes you would jump and then there'd be some sort of incident and you wouldn't be able to jump back right away. There'd be some sort of failure. So you'd always want to prepare for the worst, and having oxygen available wasn't that difficult, but I wouldn't jump unless there was oxygen available. That's one of the reasons why I eventually left the program, was that now I was well trained, Andrew was well trained, Brett was well trained, certainly McCool was well trained. I mean, the people that were coming on board weren't that well trained. And I was even asking if they knew basic first aid. And I couldn't quite seem to get an answer to that. Brett remembers some of them. And I decided that I wasn't going to jump anymore with these people. I just didn't feel comfortable with them. And, well, the jump room was changing by that time. Apparently, they were going to let more and more people jump. But
they were going to let more people jump?
Say again?
Did you say they were going to let more people jump?
Well, the people that were jumping were more, how can I put this, casual civilians who had no specialty.
Right.
See, I'm a specialist. Andrew would be considered a specialist. Brett would be considered a specialist. They weren't specialists. They were lay people who somehow got into the program and were beginning to jump. And that's when I left Mount Shasta, because I didn't particularly, and then went back, detailed over to the Navy again. So what happened after, I don't know. I do know a lot of the jump rooms are going to be closed down because this whole project was being winding down, which is becoming extremely expensive. And, you know, how many times you're going to jump to the same place? At some point, it just didn't seem to be practical.
But if you couldn't confirm where you were jumping to, I mean, were you having people land, you know, under the ocean and drowning, or trapped in the middle of a mountain, or?
No, Lisa, the jump rooms involved an infrastructure on Earth and a receiving infrastructure on Mars. The one in El Segundo at 999 North Sepulveda, the one that I knew primarily, you would enter the elevator on the ground floor. It was sort of in the middle of the building. You'd walk around this marble facade and go into an elevator bank, and then enter the elevator. It was on one wall of that interior room on the ground floor. You would then go up to the 5th floor. The door would open, and there was another kind of marble room that was like a Fijian suite at a law firm, basically a big marble counter. And there was one individual working there, always, who would take our name. We would write down our name, we would sign our name, we would write our date of birth and our social security number. Now, I find it interesting that one of the elements of the Obama birther or identity mystery is that he has dozens and dozens, maybe even 100 or more social security numbers, which is illegal and certainly a very foolish thing to do for a Harvard-educated lawyer who was aspiring to the presidency to do. I think an explanation for that, and for, again, maybe a reason for propagating the whole birther controversy, is to de-link President Barack Obama from his original Barry Soetoro identity, because it was as Barry Soetoro that he participated in the Mars jump room program with us. So maybe the issuing of dozens and dozens of social security numbers is an attempt to dilute the one that may be present in the logbook for Barry Soetoro, because I always wrote my sole social security number and the name that I was given at birth. And for that matter, he was using his legitimate legal name at that time, which was Barry Soetoro. He had been legally adopted by his mother's second husband, an Indonesian gentleman named Soetoro. So there was no deception there. But it's curious that we were writing our social security number in the logbook, and now we find from Dr. Jerome Corsi and others that President Obama has been issued perhaps even 150 false social security numbers during the 30 years since the jump room program. So after signing in to indicate that we had gone on that jump, signing in the logbook, as it were, we would re-enter the elevator. It would go up an additional 3 floors, and then it seemed to move horizontally I went back and reconnoitered the jump room with Bill Ryan and Carrie Cassidy of Project Camelot during a filming that took place in August of 2010. And Carrie pointed out that there seemed to be a receiving pod at the back of the building that was completely extraneous to any normal function of an office building. And that may very well have been a kind of a receiving pod that the elevator then translated south across the top of that building into a kind of a holding infrastructure of some kind before the room itself began this morphing process that I described. Basically, about 5 minutes after the lights started blinking at the bottom and the top of the interior of this elevator-like box we found ourselves in, which had been the elevator that we'd gotten from the floor to the fifth floor and then from the fifth floor to the eighth floor, it would just start twisting hellaciously, producing far more of a deracinating effect on human perception and balance and physical normalcy than the most disruptive amusement park ride, the spin out or whatever. I mean, it was a real mind-bending and stomach-twisting experience. Because not just the jump room, but our cells inside of it were being twisted into a pretzel, into a spiral-like shape. And then after about 10 minutes of that, the spiral would right itself as the cylinder corrected itself back into a box. And about 5 minutes after it had recorrected itself back into a box, the door would open and we were somewhere that we believed was Mars, because Mars is what we had been told was the domain that we would be visiting during our training. But I would point out that with any of these pro-Mars pieces of evidence, anything that's real can be simulated, right? So, for example, the proof based on where the moons Phobos and Deimos were in the Martian sky isn't a conclusive proof, because a real natural object like a celestial body can be simulated. The real proof is, and I think this goes to the genius of Bernie's investigation back in the day and his explanation of it now, which is, what did the non-ordinary elements show us? And let me just cite one anecdote that shows what we learned about this SQE, because at least on the night run that we've described, we did clearly access an SQE. What happened is Bernie had the idea to go up in the darkness of night. I remember that Bernie and Regina and another female chrononaut met me at the landing of my elevator at the UCLA dorms, and we drove over to a kind of barracks near the El Segundo jump room location. And the women shared a room, and I shared a room with Bernie. I remember I took the upper bunk, and we tried to sleep from about 5 p.m. to when the girls came down to our room and woke us up at 1 o'clock to do a 2 o'clock jump, 2 a.m. jump from the jump room at the El Segundo site. We have the identity of that second woman who shared the room with Regina Dugan, but we're not going to reveal it until she agrees to let us reveal who she was. She's a member of a distinguished family and has a distinguished career, so we want to, out of respect to her, we want to get her consent for us to identify who she was. But she's a real person, and we know her name, and we know her background.
Have you made contact with her?
We have attempted to make contact with her through a relative of hers who is a mutual contact. Mm-hmm. But she's not yet had a discussion with any of us about, confirming that she was the individual in that experience. But I would add that out of the 4 individuals, well, actually 5, we have Brett, Bernie, and myself, and then we have information passed along from President Obama through some of Bernie's contacts that he doesn't want to address being in the program while he's still president of the United States. But when he does come forward, as he plans to when he leaves office, he wants us to know that he remembers being in the program and that thinking back about it has a kind of a dreamlike quality. And I knew that Bernie had successfully reached the president through intermediaries, because that's exactly the sensation I had when I revisited my memory after Brett re-entered my life in April of 2010, is I would look back at these memories and it almost felt like one long dream, like a lucid dream kind of, epic dream that you have, Mm-hmm. And yet we know it was real because we connected up all the dots regarding our training and everything, the brainwashing, the other people who were involved being real people and not dreamed personalities and so forth. So we tried to sleep. I find it very difficult to sleep late at night like that, knowing I'm going to get up in the early morning hours. So I was just laying there looking at the ceiling. I remember that Bernie seemed to be sleeping. Then the ladies came down to our room, and we were taken not by taxi, but by just an individual in a private car over to the jump room. And just this shows you the detail that you recover after 30 years. Bernie had his backpack under his green woolen army issue sweater with the epaulets, and I said to him, "You look like a turtle," by which I didn't mean to disparage him. I meant that physically, the bump on his back beneath his sweater made him look like a turtle, or look turtle-like is what I meant. And I was just engaging in small talk. And when Bernie reconnected with me in December of 2011, that's one of the first things he remembered. I remember you when I came to pick you up at the UCLA dorms. You said I looked like a turtle. You don't like being called a turtle. Now that's so specific. How could we be making that up, right?
Yep.
Bernie was literally given military issue, so he's in one of those thick army sweaters with his backpack under his sweater, presumably to protect it from the elements on the surface, which makes sense for a seasoned field investigator of anything, right? So, and that's what Bernie definitely was. Okay, so we jump out to the corkscrew, again, which is a spiral-shaped jump room infrastructure. And I remember walking out with all four of us. There may have been two others on the jump, but if there were, we met them at the jump room, because I just remember coming out with the three others. And we were about 10 feet out. Bernie did something very interesting. He took out a kind of a stick, like a cane-like device, an extension, and he used some epoxy to put a mirror on it, and he looked out beyond the door of the jump room to see if anything was out there, kind of like around the corner before we committed ourselves to entering the curtilage of the opening to the outside in the pitch blackness of night, in this domain that was either Mars in the night or some SQE, and we could hear the sounds of these dinosaur-like creatures mewing in the distance like tropical animals in a tropical rainforest. So it was very haunting. And we finally committed to walk out in a line, shoulder to shoulder, when we determined that there wasn't some creature right around the corner of the door of the jump room, the orifice of the jump room, and which opened to the surface just like the end of a shell, like a conch shell, let's say. And we stepped about 3 or 4 steps, and Regina cried out, "There's something behind us." And we all skedaddled and basically ran hither and yon all over that location, being chased by these small dinosaur-like reptiles. They weren't the big T-Rex shaped velociraptor bodied like ones that I had seen eat 2 of my team members, a middle-aged male and a teenage boy, Brett having witnessed the second fatality. They were more like smaller dinosaurs with a pommel-shaped pate on top of their head and these protuberances, kind of like some of the creatures I found in NASA's images that seem to have these protuberances or sort of like air bladders on top of their head, which we think may be devices that, as small dinosaur-like creatures, they use to make sounds, like mating sounds or whatever. But they weren't vicious predators. They were more run-of-the-mill dinosaur-like creatures. And of course, in our training under Ed Dames, he had explained that some of the human-sized animals might chase us and just play around with us, but either run out of energy and not eat us or not even attack us. But in this instance, we could see each other running hither and yon in an area, let's say about 1/8 of a mile, maybe 1/16 of a mile around the periphery of the jump room. We really only went maybe a couple hundred feet. But we were all screaming along, trying to run as fast as possible. But the non-ordinary element was not being chased by dinosaur-like creatures in the darkness, because after all, Ed Dames had included small dinosaur-like creatures in his lectures of the animals on the surface, some of which were completely benign, according to him as the instructor. But in each of our locations, as we were chased by a particular individual creature, the ground was illuminated, as if we were each being hit by a spotlight, but there was no spotlight from any light source causing that light effect. Now on Earth,
More as if it was caused by the contact of your feet with the ground?
Yeah, when you have like a you have like a theater opening and they put the Klieg lights out in front of the theater
Mm.
and it shoots this big beam of light up into space, and then if you point that kind of light on the ground or a similar bright light from a helicopter on the ground, you illuminate the ground potentially around somebody, and there's bright light on their face, and there's shadows behind them where the light cannot get through their bodies. But you see the beam. Often the beam will illuminate dust in the atmosphere or smoke or clouds or something. That's not the lighting effect that was focused on us. It was just illuminated ground. So, I would look 100 feet to my left and see Regina running in the opposite direction, being chased by one of these small dinosaur-like creatures. And the ground was illuminated, but there was no spotlight on it. Now, according to the laws of electro-optics as they exist on Earth, you can do that, let's say, on ice. If you have an ice rink and you have a bottom to the ice rink, you can run spotlights up through the ice on a tracking system. But where you have normal soil, you can't light the area around a person except from either the ground or the sky, from the air. And when you do illuminate somebody like that with the forms of light that we know about, to create a bright light around them on the ground, in all of the forms of light that we have on Earth, it's a non-local effect in the sense that a light beam has to be pointed at the person. But this was creating the effect of the ground being illuminated around us with no shadow behind us and no illumination from a beam above us or on the surface. So it was a new form of light altogether, which bespoke the fact that whatever environment we were in was a non-ordinary one, at least on that jump. But then it got even more strange. And
Sorry, yeah, and then it gets strange. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, here we go. So I'm running along, and one of them grabbed my right arm and pulled it off. And I thought, great, okay, now I'm going to be eaten, or I'm going to spend the rest of my life without my right hand, which is my dominant hand and arm, because I'm a righty. And so, I had always made comments to my father and Courtney Hunt and even Bernie. It's kind of like, what's in it for us? You guys aren't even paying us, and we could get eaten up there. So, thank you for imposing this sacrifice on us. I was getting a little bit flippant at one point because I realized I'd been put up to this Herculean task, and it was very clear we had been conscripted into the U.S. space program in a way that would sometimes include nightmarish experiences. So this thing ripped my arm off, and we ultimately got free of them. The lights went off, and they abandoned the hunt, and each of us ultimately got into the hallway of the tunnel, the spiral tunnel of the corkscrew that led down to the actual jump room infrastructure about a story below ground. And we gathered, which was kind of like an elevator in a mine shaft. There was a human operator there. It had kind of a glass and steel construction, kind of the kind of apparatus somebody might sit in to operate a steam shovel, kind of. Mm-hmm. And very industrial, very something that my dad could have designed at Parsons, because he worked a lot in mining and metallurgy, and he was a former coal miner, so he was no stranger to the kinds of apparatus that you have, apparati that you have in deep digging projects like mines. So anyway, we all gathered back there, and Bernie shoved us in, and he said, "I've got a theory," and he closed the door, and he gave the sign to the operator to send us back, and Bernie stayed. So talk about a courageous human being. He stayed back there because he had a theory after we had been chased all over the place by small dinosaurs. One had ripped off my arm.
So you at this point are back in the jump room, bleeding and armless.
I basically had no right arm, and it didn't hurt, and it was bleeding minimally. But I basically had, from my own perspective, no right arm, and a little stump for where my arm had been, and the bloody remains of my right sleeve of my shirt. And I'm saying I didn't, we're all jabbering. I didn't think we would survive that. God, they almost killed us. So we get back to the debriefing room at the El Segundo site at 999 North Sepulveda, which was Oddly enough, or not so oddly, it was 1 story below ground. It was like this concrete fallout shelter in the sub-basement level where there was a debriefing room where basically Major Dames had a desk that he would sit at. I was sitting on the right looking at Major Dames. Regina was to my left. And Ed said, we'll start the debriefing when Bernie gets here. So about 10, 15 minutes later, Bernie walks in and he's standing there smiling because the discovery that he was hoping to make, which I'll let him tell, basically he had made. But just to close out on what I then experienced, Regina was crying and I was basically jabbering away frenetically, basically hysterical, saying, here it is, guys. We've reached that point. I've now lost my arm. Great. I'm going to have to live the rest of my life as a single amputee because you had to put me in this goddamn secret space program that I didn't be in. We're not being paid. We're not even on the GI Bill. I had to scrape money to go back to UCLA from working over the summer, study, parental contribution, federal debt, and you just sent me to Mars and I've lost my arm and we're not even being put on the GI Bill. I know Bernie remembers this performance on my part.
But what about medical attention? I mean, did anybody else, did Ed comment that, oh, what happened to your arm? Did anyone need...
I wasn't bleeding to death. Because then Bernie said to me, Andy, look at your arm. Grab your arm. Andy, I want you to take your left hand and I want you to reach over and touch your right arm. Is it there? And I said, wow, yeah, it is. So what I had experienced, Lisa, is on the surface, a holographic effect or a psychotronic effect or both had been created where I had been convinced my arm had been torn off. It had looked like that had happened when it happened. But then by the time I was down in El Segundo after the jump room returned, we went through the normal nauseating, twisting experience in the jump room. This one being a little bit more trying because we're hyperventilating from stress. I think I've just had my arm torn off, somehow clean, because I'm not faint or bleeding to death out of my right arm socket. But we're there, and then Bernie arrives, he says, and he's smiling like a Cheshire cat, and he goes, Andy, touch your arm. No, take your, I want you to take your left hand and reach over and touch your right arm. Is it there? And I began to calm down and go, yeah, well, it is here. And then as I began to touch it more, it came into view. And we realized that we had been subjected to a pseudo attack by actual life forms or by holographic life forms on Mars, on some contained environment on the surface of Mars, underneath Mars, and synthetic environment that was made to seem like the Mars we had been trained for, but which was not Mars or even a contained area on Mars. It was one of those three things.
So Bernie, what was your hunch?
I had a theory before I had arrived, because these were typical of the reports of the casualties. And when I was sitting down with the administration and part of the staff, most of the military men, who were going over these reports, and they were briefing me and discussing these matters with me, they were saying, you have to nail this down. Now, I have one report that says this man was seriously injured, and a report 2 days later saying there's nothing wrong with him. So it was typical of the reports at the time. Mm-hmm. And these reports were escalating from 40 to 50 per month. Now we have like 70 reports per month of this type. So one of the things I was charged to do, to go there and find out why these reports were in conflict. Now, they always very carefully worded things. I never said dinosaurs, I said creatures, two-legged, four-legged. And I never said that this person was missing an arm. I said this man was a casualty for a day or two. Now he appears to be perfectly fine. You understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
And that,
but also, you're not just talking about losing a limb. I mean, you tantalizingly said earlier that someone could be eaten, and, their remains left on the surface.
Those were observed reports. There were no pictures. There were no films. There were witnesses who said that they were attacked by creatures and they were seriously maimed. Now, before you left on a jump, you had 3 people in the jump room, you came back with 3 people. You had 4 people in the jump room, you came back with 4 people. And this is what I mean by the contradictions of the reports, or the conflicting reports. How could you have 3 people jump per day? 3 groups of people jump 3-4 times a day. That's 12 people, that's 36 jumps, let's say. And then have everyone accounted for, but you have a casual report of someone getting mauled by a creature. Seriously, that they were left behind, that everyone ran back to the jump room and jumped back. Now, the same amount of people that left came back, but the report said that somebody was left behind that was seriously mauled by a creature. Now, that's a contradiction. It's a contradiction that the report said that this person was missing his arm. But 2 or 3 days later, this person is fine.
So Andy, you said you saw a young man, or an elderly man and a young boy, eaten by one of these creatures. Did they too turn out to be okay?
I didn't see their recovery, but the first episode, Courtney Hunt and I were walking across the surface by ourselves. We were always with different groups. Sometimes it was Courtney and Brett and I. Sometimes it was Regina, Bernie, and I, or just Courtney. I remember I was on a couple sort of digs with Barry and Bernie where we had digging equipment and we were trying to determine whether we would reach anything, digging a hole in the soil, and we actually did reach this black rubber surface at one point. But in the first casualty that I witnessed, the first fatality, we were walking across the surface and we heard somebody yelling, "Hey, over here, come over here. Look, I'm over here, I'm over here now." And we went around these rocks and we saw a man about 45 years old, slightly overweight, maybe one of the project engineers, running back and forth as one of the Tyrannosaurus Rex lethal type of predators was trying to follow his movements. We had been trained, actually we had a practical exercise on this one day during the training program, where we were told if you were in the immediate vicinity of one of the lethal predators and your number was probably up, you probably weren't going to be able to even just take off running across the surface from it. You might somehow get back to your team members and hide behind a rock or something, but if you were within 100 feet of one of these predators and they wanted to eat you, you weren't getting away alive. So he was running, trying to drag it away from his other team members. And he finally was urged by them to sit down with his legs folded on the ground and not move. And when he did that, this very stupid acting dinosaur-like creature cocked its head to the left and right and moved forward and kind of focused on him to the point of going right up to his nose. And he smiled and then screamed. And the thing moved in with its jagged teeth and bit him in half and ate one of the pieces. And then scampered off, and I whispered to Courtney, "Should we get going? Is it going to attack us?" And he said no. And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "We think that to survive in this kind of ecosystem, they have to be very fastidious feeders." In other words, if they overate prey, they would become prey in such an ecosystem, and hence would not be naturally selected for survival as a species. So he said, "You can just relax. It'll just scamper off. Every time it eats one of our team members, it just leaves." And it did. So when we walked away from his remains, he had not sprung to life. Now, in the case of the young man, the teenager, it was a blonde kid, kind of a surfer kid from Southern California, who we believe his first name was David, because one of the women in our party, after he was bitten, yelled, "Be strong, David, your suffering will soon be over." David had foolishly jumped down some aluminum siding that some of the Parsons engineers, under my dad's supervision, had placed along a roadbed because they were trying to create safe areas near the jump rooms, so that you had these raised roadbeds that then had aluminum siding along their sides into a kind of a drop off of 12 to 15 feet, so that even if there were some of these dinosaur-like predators down below, they wouldn't be able to scamper up the slippery surface of these aluminum palisades on the sides of the roads. In fact, that was the one jump that my dad went on because he had previously been disqualified because of his heart condition. He had heart disease. But they allowed him to go despite the relative paucity of oxygen and the stress of the jump room. And we're walking along as a party that included myself, my father, Courtney Hunt, Brett's father, a woman who, for all we know, could have been Barry's mom, probably Barry. And this kid from Southern Cal just took the opportunity to jump off the road down the aluminum slide like it was a slide at an amusement park or a children's playground. He actually went, wee, kidding as he slid down because he thought he was going to be able to get up. He didn't understand that they had been constructed to make it almost impossible to scamper up, even for a relatively deft four-legged creature like ourselves. Clearly, the dinosaur-like creatures with small upper appendages would find it impossible to go up such a slope. But so he got stuck down there, and then after being down there for about 5 minutes, we were reaching down to try to get his hand. At one point, there was a suggestion that we, grab Brett by the ankles and try to use him as a device to grab the kid by the hands and pull both of them up. And then we said, no, Brett may slip down there, and we decided not to do that. About 5 minutes later, this little, not little, but this one of the 16-foot predator type Tyrannosaurus Rexes scampered into view and began chasing the kid all over this ravine that he was in. In fact, there was a stage-like platform, almost like an ancient Greek dramatic stage, in this ravine, and actually the young man went up on top of that and danced around like Rocky, celebrating some kind of victory, and then jumped off it. And that's when the predator came into view and began chasing him. So he went around in a zigzag pattern like we had been instructed, and ultimately became exhausted after 15 or 20 minutes of those short trots trying to evade this thing, and sat down. And when it came towards him, like the middle-aged man, right before it bit him, he smiled. So I don't think that being eaten to death is naturally a cause for human smiling. So one of our theories is that middle-aged man and this blonde kid were not part of our team, but they were inserted into the scene to see how we would respond to our fellow human beings being consumed by vicious predators on the surface. Brett and I have observed that we don't remember being with that young man, that he was not part of our team before he suddenly appeared on the roadbed walking with us and then jumped down the palisade.
Ah.
We think that may have been input from the hologram generating the SQE. Now, that's as far as Brett has gone in terms of, confronting the evidence that at least some of the time we may have been in some kind of synthetic quantum environment. So I didn't see either of them suddenly come back to life, like Gumby. But
would he have then have been included amongst the list of casualties, though, from Bernie's perspective?
Perhaps. I mean, to the extent that he didn't reconstitute before we got to the jump room and were debriefed in El Segundo, and Bernie may remember this as well. We were always debriefed with the what happened next. And I mean, that might go on. We might be up on the surface for a half hour and then face a 2-hour debriefing on the surface, back on Earth. Mm-hmm. What happened? Oh, you saw a predator? What color was it? Really? Okay. What did it look? Draw it for me. I mean, just these real grillings about what we had experienced, because they were trying to determine characteristics of Mars or what environment we were actually being sent to via the jumping.
So some of these statistics of casualties would have included simply anecdotal descriptions by yourself and Brett and others.
Yeah, when we were being debriefed, we would have provided and did provide anecdotal accounts that one of our team members, maybe one who drifted into our team, because of course people were jumping from different jump rooms, and you were sometimes walking by seeing some other team at several hundred feet or even farther, going, God, we didn't see those people back in El Segundo. Those might
Mm-hmm.
have been another team that maybe took the New York jump room that day or that hour, and so we when we were debriefed, I must have said something like, "Yeah, this blonde kid showed up in our column of explorers as we were walking along one of the elevated roadways where the aluminum palisades had been created to kind of segregate safe areas from unsafe areas, and he just was seized by a moment of high foolishness and jumped down the palisade and ultimately got chased and bitten to death." At great pain, by the way, too. He was curled up in a fetal position, moaning after being bitten the first time because the predator just sat there and watched him die. That was one of the things that had terrified us that Ed Dames said, and also gave rise to the security of having a suicide pill or a willingness just to get your head bitten off, basically. Because Ed Dames said that if you used the flash gun on one of the larger predators, you might wound him, but you more than likely would antagonize him, and he might play with you as he was killing you. So it's
Not a
one thing,
pleasant thought, no.
right? It's one thing to be bitten to death by a predator, but to actually be toyed with over an extended period of predation was absolutely terrifying in the extreme. So we left him basically just his remains that we could see down there. He seemed to be dead. In fact, we viewed the moment of his expiration and just walked along, all just utterly devastated, and back down to the jump room and back to El Segundo. So my dad had ended up having a pretty hellish jump, that one jump that he was permitted to go up. And I didn't see that young man from Southern Cal, that blonde boy named David, ever again. So my account would have entered the report from the debriefing. That would have become the kind of casualty report that Bernie was then responding to. But the mystery is that other than, or unlike rather, casualty reports you get from the field during wartime, where somebody is either killed permanently, injured semi-permanently, or taken prisoner in a healthy or an injured status, Bernie was also receiving these reports of somebody who had been reported killed suddenly reappearing, like reappearing at the jump room on the surface and jumping back to New York or to California. So presumably, if it was all SQE, that young man didn't, or he was part of the simulation, and there was nothing that he consisted of except electrons that were being simulated into a teenager from Earth. If he was a member of our team, because we know that some of our team members, like myself, lost appendages that then suddenly reappeared, could have very well reconstituted and then showed up at the jump room, or taken the jump room and then showed up at El Segundo and knocked on the door of Major Dame's office or whatever.
But couldn't Bernie, would you have been in a position to validate that kid's involvement in the program?
These are the kind of reports that were summarized and brought to the administration's attention. And that is one of the reasons why I was in the West Coast jump room, to sort this out. Now, as best I could determine, there weren't any fatalities at the time. Now, I don't know who these people were. They were never identified.
Right.
These people who saw these casualties never clearly identified who they saw. They said, I think it's one of the project engineers. Okay, who? And how is it you seem to know all the project engineers? You wouldn't know that. They wouldn't have privy to that information. Andrew would know because his dad was a project engineer. And then we'd be talking some of the other project engineers. There's a lot of project engineers. And who is this boy David? Who knows him? And that's some of the things I was looking into, and you just couldn't seem to determine. All hands were accounted for at the time of the jump. Everybody who jumped came back. Now, where do you go from there?
Where do you go from there? Exactly.
Right. So, I mean, there's no question that, I mean, when I began my truth campaign, I resolved that it wasn't going to be about my truth. It was going to be about promoting truthfulness, the search for the truth. So I couldn't superimpose my judgment over Brett's determination that it was Mars or Bernie's finding that it was some kind of synthetic environment. And I also had to be true to the facts of what happened. The facts are that on that jump, I subjectively believed that my right arm had been wrenched off by a vicious predator during this terrifying night run, and that by the time I really examined the situation, 15 or 20 minutes back on the surface, in the briefing room, it was there. So I have to be true to the phenomenology as it unfolded among all of us. And that is, in fact, what happened. I remember the expression on Bernie's face. I remember how he knew he had proved his premise, at least to the point that some of the jumps were going to a synthetic environment. Because I was known to be reliable as to my mental state and my perceptions. They had been tested and found to be very accurate when I was a child attached to Project Pegasus. So here's Bernie looking at me going, yep, Andy subjectively believes that he has lost his right arm because that's what he saw. But I didn't feel it, and there was very little blood. There was almost like the special effect of losing an arm, with a tattered right shirt cuff and, right shirt arm of the shirt and blood. But I wasn't in severe pain like if I had had my arm cut off in battle. And so I have to be true to that experience. We even know the identity of, not just of Regina, but we know the identity of the other woman who went with us on that jump. So we have potentially 3 witnesses of the loss of my arm in addition to myself, but at least now we have 2. We have my memory and we have Bernie's corroboration of my memory. And Bernie's background as an intelligence official detailed over the years variously to the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy can be readily established. I mean, he was basically a presidential level investigator.
But Bernie, did you choose that particular time, a 2 a.m. Jump? Was there something about that particular time or place that you felt would help you prove your hunch or disprove your hunch?
That first jump with Andrew that we did at night, that was by design. We were supposed to jump during the day, but there were electrical failures. And I had been up, we got some sleep, and then they woke us up about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. They were going to jump at 2 a.m. I didn't choose the time of the jumping.
Okay.
But I did have a lot of theories, which I put papers up before I met Andrew, about what was going on in these jump rooms or these places that we were going to. And then the papers would be circulated laterally among certain people. And then evidence would be collected to either prove or disprove what the theory was.
Well, it certainly seems to be the only one that can support what Andrew's experience was with losing a limb. I mean, clearly he didn't physically lose a limb in reality.
Yeah, that event, that anecdote establishes as a hard data point that at least some of the jumps were to a synthetic quantum environment. But that still leaves open the possibility that some of the jumps were not, that they were to the surface, and that NASA has been lying about critical natural conditions on the surface, like oxygen content of the atmosphere, like atmospheric pressure.
Well, everywhere that life is sustainable, there is life. So for them to be putting out information that supports the idea that planets like Mars are actually capable of supporting life would just throw too many spanners in the works, wouldn't it?
Yes, and actually the intermediary position would be, since the threat assessment that Barry and Regina and I participated in that summer of 1980 indicated that there was an event where some of our astronauts were not rescued on the surface by the Homo sapien Martians, the Homo maris terris species, after they had promised to provide rescue services, causing Regina to believe that they couldn't be trusted, that their goodwill couldn't be relied upon, and that they might potentially be hostile to human civilization on Earth. that anecdote indicates that there was human visitation by the U.S. secret space program to the actual Mars. The other thing is that the elements of whatever containment we were in also leave open the possibility for a contained area on the actual Mars. And I salute Bernie for actually referencing that fact in a recent interview, the fact that just because sometimes some kind of synthetic quantum environment was being manipulated, there was also all the hallmarks of a containment dome on Mars. And so the evidence that would support that was when he had Barry shoot the flare and it hit some kind of ceiling, and also when Courtney Hunt and I walked a quarter of a mile and reached a clear, basically invisible containment wall of some kind.
You're reminding me of that the movie with Jim Carrey, where he's on a TV show, but he doesn't know it.
Right, the Truman Show.
The Truman Show. That's it.
We may have been on the Martian humanoid version of the Truman Show, where it wasn't Mars unadorned, and it wasn't a synthetic quantum environment out in some arbitrary location in the time-space continuum, but it was the real Mars, but they had put some kind of invisible containment dome around an area of Mars to allow us to visit Mars without despoiling the entire planet, but then within that containment dome could work certain holographic effects. That's entirely possible. So
where do you think anybody knows the real answers?
Well, I would defer to Bernie's judgment on that, because he was an intelligence official and I was a teenage chrononaut. So I think he has a clearer view of that, of what then followed.
Bernie, what do you think? Do you think anybody really figured it out and actually has the answers and the truth?
Well, I think we got partial answers. I can probably get very close to partial answers. I believe that these gray creatures built these areas that we jumped to. And like Mount Shasta must have been a place, like a train station. And you can go from Mount Shasta to different places. Not every place, but it's a few places. And that these grays were architecting all this, and they were showing us things under their guidance, and that from time to time, they were doing some sort of an experiment where they would simulate some sort of experience. Now, as to what purpose it could serve for them, I do not know. But they were simulating some sort of experience which we would experience: death, fear, horror, or some sort of confusion, for reasons which are unclear to this day. But this is what was being done.
Based on other reports from people who have experienced encounters with the Greys, they seem to be very interested in simply our human responses and observing them, dissecting them, researching them. So perhaps it was simply to use the participants in this program as more guinea pigs for observation. Also,
yes, absolutely. And also we have to remember that we found during Project Pegasus that and as Bernie described, when we first, under Project Rainbow, were shooting the cylinders into the fourth dimension, or arguably the fifth dimension, that they were observing our time travel activities. So that already, by 1981, 82, 83, when we were having these jump room experiences, the U.S. time-space program, in terms of periodically sending U.S. chrononauts to those interstitial domains in the time-space continuum that the Greys and other advanced intelligent life forms operate in, was already 15 years old. So since they realized we were shooting canisters into the fourth and fifth dimension, we were sending even school children in the Montauk chair to their own futures, we were tunneling through the time-space continuum between New Jersey and New Mexico with a decanting operation in Ohio using Tesla teleportation. By 1980, 81, 82, there had been a 15-year history of the U.S. Defense Department placing U.S. chrononauts in their domain. So that by then, they may have decided, okay, they've got this jump room program to Mars. Let's let them go to Mars. But since they haven't qualified for total participation in the universe, let's construct some kind of containment facility on Mars, and let's sometimes study them by manipulating the environment that they're visiting. So we can determine what is this thing that humans have when one of their fellows is injured, they seem to shift emotionally. This water comes from their eye sockets. Their facial expressions change. What is this? I mean, they may literally have turned the jump room into a basis for studying our very humanity. And as Bernie was presenting tonight, it occurred to me that many times the environments I was sent to in Project Pegasus implicated some kind of human emotion. You know, the Lincoln assassination site, the distress of a great leader being murdered, the Gettysburg site, the excitement of a great leader giving an auspicious speech. The time I was pulled out of the irrigation ditch in rural Holland in 1800, the experience of being cast away among a group of relatively ignorant local inhabitants wondering who the hell I was. The experience of being chronovized to that filthy tenement in the Five Points neighborhood of New York City, the horror and heartache of feeling that I was stranded in an utterly impoverished environment. I mean, all of the locations that I was sent to using different time travel technologies always had some fairly substantial human emotional charge to them. So maybe the Greys were manipulating these time travel devices from the beginning to study us. I think it's certainly a possibility.
It sounds as feasible as the rest of it, to be honest. You know, I mean, if what you say is actually true, then that aspect of it is just as feasible as the rest.
Well, what links all of it is that all of the different time travel technologies, whether they occurred purely psychically or in a physio-virtual way, which is how I describe how the holograms of the chronovisors operate on human experience, or physically, such as when we were tunneling through time-space with the Stargates and the Tesla teleporters and so forth. The commonality is that all of them placed human chrononauts outside their ordinary realm of human experience on Earth and placed them in the domain that the Greys and other advanced humanoids not only occupy, but literally inhabit. That's their domain, as Bernie had described, you know, as Bernie has described and described tonight, in terms of that's where they operate, and they were aware of us entering their domain. Just as we would be if extraterrestrial biological entities visited Earth or have visited Earth. So they may have been alarmed, and they may have been studying our human factors, our human characteristics, because they were aware that under the Prime Directive, they didn't necessarily have the right to annihilate us, to prevent us from accessing their fourth and fifth dimensional reality, but they wanted to know more about us so they could cope with the fact that we were starting to enter their dimensional domain, and also doing something incredibly stupid to the physical substrates of the third and fourth dimensions, which is blowing up nuclear weapons that were tearing at the very fabric of time-space. So they were clearly alarmed about us, and maybe
we gave them plenty of reason to be, for sure.
Yeah, maybe they decided to use our evolving time-space program, which was sort of the positive side of our foray in atomic physics, to study us and maybe determine whether we should be quarantined on Earth or quarantined on synthetic environments and the planets that we were going to, or whether at the end of the day we were a potentially positive species that could be trusted with entering their domain. But certainly we have the fact that the visits to our domain by their craft accelerated after we began blowing up nuclear weapons and spreading ionizing radiation all over the planet. And clearly they were alarmed. And maybe they extended their investigation of us not just to the so-called alien abduction phenomenon, but to hijacking our emerging time-space program for their own purposes.
You know, Andrew, there's a whole other discussion here about the technology involved and what that technology could do for us if it was unveiled. But that's a whole other 2 or 3 hour discussion. But we have been talking for just over 3 hours, and we've covered a lot of ground. And I want to thank you both for joining me. And perhaps we could do a follow-up in the future. But I think we've given people plenty to contemplate for now.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to appear on your show.
Thank you, and thank you to Bernie as well.
Thank you for letting me appear on your show.
And hopefully there'll be more coming forward.
Well, we have the woman who went on the night run with us. We have several possible chrononauts that Bernie's developed, and we have Barack Obama and Regina Dugan. Barack Obama is still president, so presumably is not going to be addressing this. And Regina has left DARPA for Google. So I'm optimistic that at least several more jumpers will be coming forward, and that will pretty much seal the case that the jump room program existed. And my argument is that relating back, it establishes that the time-space program itself existed.
You know, there's a whole other discussion there about Google and DARPA and that connection too, I'm sure. But for now, we'll leave it at that, and I want to thank you both again very much.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome.